John McNamara looked at the warning missive from the Ascended Co. Since their failed attempt at humiliating the Terran Republic 10 years earlier, and the triumph of the Republic over the Coalition, relations had not improved. On the screen beside the missive were the budgetary figures for the year. The vast expanse of new territory belonging to the Terran Republic had not yielded vast economic growth to match the territory. I swear I half think they fought a war just to make sure they got us to foot the bill for their modernization rather than themselves, John said, and watched one of his silver hairs drift down to the old ironwood desk. Beyond him, the holographic displays of the regional governors showed how humorous they found his poor attempt at humor. He didn't blame them for not laughing. Half of them were ruling over areas decimated by war, with many of their populations slaughtered down to half, with families still struggling to reunite and learn who lived and died, with the ruins of shattered buildings still cluttering vast streets of dwindled colonies, and an ever-worsening debt thanks to the high cost of the armada that won the war. There wasn't much to laugh about. The sale of bonds to fund the fleet had saved the Republic, but with the cost of providing care to over 30 million wounded and traumatized veterans, not to mention paying for the war bonds that paid for the armada and the cost of rebuilding. Debt spending was now the norm, and had been through the last administration and a half before himself. "We need more energy," he said, stating the obvious. "And we need more ships. The Ascended Co. are still a problem on the border. And need I remind you, Mr. President, if they cross over again..." The governor of the stellar south region of Borderia was, ironically, a member of the race which once worshipped the Co. as gods. After shattering the myth of the Ascended Co.'s invincibility by defeating their armada and reclaiming the lost territories, the old religion lost a lot of its perceived social and political power. There were even reports of some cultists who now deified humans, and others who believed humans were demons. The latter makes a lot more sense than the former, John thought, but he kept it as just that, a thought. The governor of the region was a pragmatist and former scientist. It made him both easier and harder to deal with. Easier in that he had no religious beliefs about humans, harder in that he was stubborn and hard to persuade. But at least he was pragmatic, though when he was right, that was the hardest thing. "I'm aware, and I intend to allocate another 40 battleships to the area. You won't be reliant on the militia system. If they cross the border, you will have enough to stop them. You're also authorized to keep a purely militaristic battle station at every hyperlane along the border." The faces of the other governors, human and non-human alike, showed their displeasure. For some it was based on politics. A fleet in the area was a representation of their region's importance, and even with the limited authority of a governor to call on them, it represented personal power. Rorona Jean was an exception to that displeasure. "I'm happy to raise a call-up of more of my people to assist the other border regions in their security, even if it be that they are stationed on the far side of the Republic. If, of course, the local governors will handle the payment of their wages." For John McNamara, Rorona Jean was both a blessing and a curse. The leader of their once most strident enemy, and the commander of their military forces, since his cousin's death and their subsequent surrender, he'd been the most ardent advocate of both peace and employment for his people. A Keynesian through and through, John thought. With their broken economy and the end of the slave trade, Rorona had pushed for his people to find employment in various government tasks, from reconstruction organizations to direct military employment. But what made him so absurdly effective is that he facilitated off-world employment for millions of his citizens in regional positions that had found prosperity in the war that shattered his formerly great empire. His citizens thus found work, disrupted nothing at home, and were taxed directly out of their automatically assessed wages that he didn't have to pay. The reduced numbers reduced needs, and so out of all the regions devastated by war, his was on the fast track to recovery. How ironic. We won the war completely, but thanks to the Co., we suffered more loss of life and property than anybody, while the ones who started the fight in the first damn place are not only going to recover fastest, but have embedded themselves into the fabric of the Republic so well and so deeply that it is difficult to imagine not having them around. Rorona's placid face betrayed nothing, but John was not about to argue, and the other prosperous regions were quick to agree with the enticing prospect. "Taxation for the reconstruction will be included, of course," John added, and the governors reluctantly bowed their heads. Paying for the devastation wrought on the core worlds was a sore point, especially with the continued debts. "What did the Co have to say this time, Mr. President?" Rorona Jean asked, shifting the subject, much to President McNamara's relief. "That we must pay for the fleet we destroyed. More of the same about our hubris and warning us not to build colonies on the unoccupied systems. Promising 1,000,000 dead for every footstep trod upon their sacred ground, that sort of thing." John rubbed his temple and wondered, did President Brown feel like this? Probably not. The man drove himself into the grave, but I swear he wasn't tired enough to die until the war was won. The fiery zealot was now all but a legend, near a deity among the liberated slaves who never imagined that anyone would fight, let alone die for them. Ordinary humans and human soldiers remembered him as the inspiring leader who guided humanity to victory through its darkest time. But John and others who had to work out the budget recalled him differently. He was a wildly impractical zealot who saw nothing but his aims and never gave a damn about the costs, and what he left behind for us to deal with was a budgetary mess and an empire so vast that unless we solve our economic situation, we'll lose it almost as fast as we got it. We're still going to cut down the size of the fleet, by the way. We simply can't afford to maintain it, and we have to eliminate a number of our star bases from the occupied regions. The cost to keep those up is even worse than the ships. We're working on new management techniques to keep administration costs down and the capacity up, but we just can't keep everything we've taken. That was the last thing the others wanted to discuss, but it beat rambling about the Co. Anger went up from every face on every hologram except for Rorona. John made a point of clearly muting them. Their shouting and raging went on regardless, until they finally got a hold of themselves and calmed down. "The border states, Ganek, Clisha, Moros, and Torrent, are too small to be a threat. Benkari are fighting a war on the other side of the border with us that shows no sign of slowing down, and none of the other states are hostile. The Co are our only true enemies, so we need to make sure we get our spending under control before the entire Republic falls into economic ruin. We can't afford your egos." John barked at them, and for a moment his rare display of temper bought him silence. He spread out his hands on the table, took a deep breath, and said, "These are temporary measures. Once we have averted this crisis, once we have restored or upgraded the infrastructure of the damaged or captured worlds, we can look at expanding beyond the core costs. So unless anybody has a suggestion for how we might manage that, this is happening." "I have one," Governor Regulus said at once. "The worlds the Co keep telling us to stay away from. They're incredibly rich systems. Very high energy output, several archaeological sites that promise to house lost technology, fantastic Gaia-quality terrain that can be quickly built up with relatively modest investment, and one even has a wormhole that will facilitate easy travel across to the far side of the galaxy. That's a lot of new trading opportunities by itself. The only real problem is the Co themselves." "Ah, yes, the only problem with rescuing the princess is the dragon that guards her, that's all," John said with a voice thick in sarcasm. "Mr. President, I hate to say it, but the truth is, this is the best possible time to act. The longer we wait, the more they will rebuild their losses. They're going to attack us anyway. Why not fight one decisive battle in a predictable place now, and then just invade and occupy their worlds? We have the fleet to manage a win, and then we'll never have to worry about the Co again. And I hate to sound callous, but every death in space is one more we don't have to keep paying for later." John McNamara clenched his jaw. The man had a point. One quick, dirty little war in an unoccupied system, a single battle, and we can then eliminate the Co forever as a threat. It definitely had its appeal, and he already knew the Terran Republic fleet could handle the Co when it was gathered into one force. "I advise against it, Mr. President," Rorona remarked. "The Co were not called gods for nothing. They have probably already recovered and rebuilt their fleet, and if you provoke them by moving into their sacred land, I can promise you they will not respond lightly." John was quiet. There was another consideration at play, too. His term was nearly up, his policies were unpopular. It was unlikely his party was going to win the next election, not unless he ended things on a high note. Like winning a war. He barely heard Rorona's objection. "The message from the Co requires an answer. I think I will give them one," he said, and cut off the comlink to end the meeting early. President John McNamara went over the objections of Rorona Jean in his mind. Despite the fact that he was from an alien race, and one that was not so long ago, an enemy to not just humanity, but so many others whose names John didn't even know. He'd won the respect of a great many figures from both sides of the last war. His objections carried weight. That is their sphere of influence, and it is sacred to them. If you attempt to encroach, you will be the aggressor, and you cannot count on your neighbors to support you. Worse, they may impose penalties such as sanctions. I know from being on the receiving end of those sanctions, it makes life difficult. Besides, even weakened, the Co are a force to be reckoned with, and one that other states would love to win the favor of. It was worse because even though he couldn't admit it, John felt his pride being pricked by the fact that so many of his advisors listened to a former enemy over himself, another human. Worse, with his presidency barely begun, he could already see the writing on the wall. President Brown's accomplishment, defeating the Co, the eradication of the slave trade over a quarter of the stellar West, the liberation of 100 billion lives, and the expansion of the Republic by over 50%. They'll make hollow stories about him for hundreds of years. They'll write books enough to fill a library with historians picking over the details of his life. He'll be remembered as a great man among great men. President Chambers, they will say, began the great unification, President King. They will say he began the manifest fate. And me? They'll write that I was president after them blame me for all the debts they left for me to pay. And that will be my epitaph. Him? He came after the people who did things. That is all they'll say of me. A few new colonies within our own territory, some reconstruction. But I have no victory, I have no legacy. Just being a lesser version of the ones before. It grated, it galled, and it was 1,000-fold worse to know so many who should have sided with him were instead siding with a regional governor of a formerly independent enemy state. His hand balled up into a fist on his desk. They want to deny me a legacy. It's just a few little worlds belonging to a people we already defeated in battle once. As far as I'm concerned, those worlds should have passed to us anyway. If it weren't for President Brown's expressed wishes that peace be made when it is offered, then it would already be ours. The more he thought, the more Jonard McNamara convinced himself that the worlds on the outskirts of Co-space could be taken easily, won in a quick skirmish, and that it would serve to prove the strength of the Republic to humble the Co for the last time. Maybe we can even occupy their worlds and erase them as a regional power. There was a pleasant thought. I'll be remembered as the man who broke the back of an ancient power once and for all. He almost salivated at the thought of such a legacy. The next few weeks took time and effort. The shipbuilders of the Republic, the weapons dealers, and all of those whose business was war were quick to throw their weight behind his efforts. Particularly when he promised a war profits tax of 5% instead of the previous administration's 98%. It will be a quick war. What does it matter? He reassured himself often. Building the political will to support the measure wasn't difficult either. A few stories about the ascended Co supporting their enemies, the promise of perfect Gaia worlds to be settled, and the promise that it would be over quickly. And a story about a ship being destroyed unprovoked close to the border. Didn't quite do it. It built support and noise, but not nearly enough. Confusion and procedure, however, did. Acting in my official capacity as the President of the Republic, I have the authority to do as I see fit, and in that capacity I am ordering the Armada of the Terran Republic to move in and take possession of the territories due to us as recompense for the destruction in the last war, and as a penalty for the destruction of the unfortunate ship which drifted too close to the border entirely by accident. The shock waves of the unprecedented claim to power, to declare war or seize territory, had to be hashed out in the courts and among legal scholars. And in that time, John's orders filled the power vacuum with his own desires, backed by the industrial interests of his allies. In his own mind he was convinced, I can tie up the courts for years. By then I'll have won the land, defeated the Co, and even if they rule against me, who will give up the land I've won? I'll be remembered as a strong president who expanded the strength of my office, secured our borders, crushed a truly ancient power, and they will teach children of my presidency for 1,000 years. It was a serene thought, and one that let him sleep peacefully at night. At first, Alan Mark watched the ramp descend to the ground of the planet tentatively named Megiddo. Once this belonged to the Co, now it is ours. He thought and looked to the sky. At low atmosphere, a supermassive battleship drifted, casting its shadow over the Eden of their new home. a secure wall that no force of their enemies could ever hope to breach. He thought back to his last encounter with the Co. I was just a child then, and I didn't have a ship above me except the ones that wanted me dead. I was so damn scared. Now I'm finally getting something from them that offers hope. He couldn't help but smile a little bit about that. Alan was no different than the others on his colony ship. Everybody settling the border worlds were either related to soldiers who died fending off the Co, or who lost homes or family members to them in the last war, and who wanted to start over somewhere else. The ramp touched down and he descended. The crowd of colonists shouted with glee and he shouted with them. They rushed down out of their ship, their feet sinking slightly in the soft ground. Work ahead would be hard. Every one of them knew it. But for that moment, right just then, they could enjoy it. Someone started laughing. They fell on the grass, staring at the sky and the metal behemoth overhead in whose shadow they lay, and it felt like it would never end. The ascended Co howled with rage hotter than the heat of their ancient sun. They were one voice, and that voice was full of loathing. Their message went out to every terminal and every device all over the Terran Republic. Remove yourselves, or 100,000 of you will die for every filthy footstep across our sacred worlds. I really don't advise this, Rorona Jean remarked again over the secure transmission. Don't tell me you're still superstitious about the ascended Co after all this time, the president said with a twitch of his eye. This was the fourth time the alien had objected, and what's worse, he'd convinced a large number of the other regional governors, and through them senators and representatives, that it was also a bad idea. Or, he asked with a grim expression, is this a question of your loyalty to the Republic? No and no. My cousins were fanatics. I believe in life and death, true and false, and above all, in results. What does a god need with starships or priests? What kind of god can die? What kind of god can be bought? He shook his head and spread out his hands in the human fashion as if to share the question rather than close it. The Co are powerful, but they can die. They are mortal. They are just older than we. What matters is they are powerful and influential. The economy of the Republic took a terrible hit in the last war. All you'll do with another is compound the deficit to create enough ships to fight them. And then there's the issue of the wounded and the damage they do. If you do this, it will not be like the last war. The Co take their territorial rights very seriously. You won last time because you drowned them in your blood. They had no reason to continue after my people surrendered, and you had only one victory in 30 battles. They could end the fighting and claim they achieved their end because they did, and— Enough! The president cut him off. Taking that land will help reinvigorate our economy and avenge the dead. It's only a few worlds, and it is unlikely they'll get the help you fear they will. Besides, in a few hours, all of the Republic will clamor for war. He killed the transmission. The warning from the Co that had reached every man and woman with an electronic device to receive it had created questions about whether or not those worlds should be withdrawn from. The online boards were filled with doubts. The holocafes where people from around the Republic and the surrounding nations gathered together in virtual spaces to relax and communicate were filled with political talk. The universities and various other institutions of law were offering up questions that were difficult to answer. No treaty specified the surrender of territory. This aggressive act will damage the prestige and trust that the Republic has with its neighbor states. Ownership and active use are not synonymous. It is the right of states as much as individuals to secure their territory, even if it is not presently being settled. Why should anyone die for an empty world when there are worlds inside our territory we can still settle? But such questions seldom found their way onto the wider news net, as large-scale funding of pro-war talking points were put forth from think tanks funded by the builders of ships of war and the weapons that went with them. Rorona sat stewing over the president's last words as he saved the recording to his private files to be transcribed and archived in print, as well as audio and video. What did he mean? A faint sense of dread gnawed at his liver like a hungry beast until the question was answered a few hours later, when an emergency broadcast activated his console. 7 hours ago, the starship Tonkin was en route to New Megiddo in order to evacuate our colonists pending a resolution to the threats of the Co, when it was attacked and destroyed by a Co armada. The ship was unarmed, and its transponder identified it as a civilian transport vessel. The entire crew was lost to a man. We go live to President McNamara as he addresses the Republic Senate. The view changed at once to reflect the sea of bodies. Some were there physically. Others had only their holographic representations in place, but it was nonetheless filled with elected officials. This day will live in infamy, as the day our peaceful ship was targeted and destroyed by a rapacious and savage enemy. If this day proves anything, it is that we cannot make peace with the Co. I therefore call upon the Senate to vote now for a formal declaration of war, and let us teach the whole galaxy that when you attack one of us, you attack all of us. He pounded his fist upon the podium, and for the first time in his political career, a roar of cheers answered back. Rorona Jean shivered with every vote cast for war, and that meant he did not stop shivering for a long, long time. The vote in the end was not unanimous. Many dared to say, "This should be investigated thoroughly. We should demand an explanation from the Co as to why they did this. This doesn't make sense. Why attack a ship that was coming to do just what they wanted?" But they were shouted down as the moment carried away all rational thought in a flood of aggressive patriotism. The final tally was 980 to 20 in favor of war, all confirmed by electronic signature and biometric security confirmation. When it was over, John McNamara was silent as if he were taking in the solemnity of the moment. Now we have war, and we must fight it to the end and fight it well. To ensure victory, I submit a budget proposal that will expand the fleet to its previous levels and ask the Senate to enact the Uniform Control Clause, allowing me alone to guide the war to its conclusion. I also call upon the citizens of the Republic, of all species, to volunteer for service against this common foe. United, the Republic cannot ever be defeated. Divided, defeat is the only possible end. By day's end, the President had everything he wanted, vote after vote, bill after bill, until it was as if he alone had the right to rule. And when it did come to a close to thunderous applause, Rorona could only think to himself, he has every power he could possibly want, except the power to win easily. "I don't like this," Admiral Susan Pike said as her armada moved into position. "I don't either. But what else can we do? We can't let their fleets get out of their home system, and we can't just let them have the initiative." Admiral Nelson asked the rhetorical question while not really expecting an answer, but his former senior and current colleague went ahead and answered anyway. "We should have built up the starbases all around the border first. We could have turned all of them into citadels. I'd feel a hell of a lot more comfortable facing a co-armada if we had a fully equipped citadel at our backs. They're so arrogant that they definitely would have attacked. Then we'd have the advantage." She drummed her dark fingers on the desk in her office, and Admiral Nelson gave a respectful nod of his head to her suggestion. "That is a fair point, but I would settle for just not splitting us up, or waiting until we had a large enough armada already built up before settling those worlds." He sighed and shook his head. "But this is what the President wants, so what can we do short of launching a coup?" he asked, and both of them shook their heads at that. "I'm in position at the transit point, time to go," she said and stood up. Admiral Nelson did the same, their misgivings reflected in one another's eyes. Each one recalled the lifetime of service, victory, and hardship. From the loss of great leaders to the simple pain of losing great soldiers, all their struggles passed before their eyes in the span of a single moment, before they snapped a crisp salute to one another and said in unison, "Good luck!" The transmission died, and Admiral Nelson returned to the bridge. "Admiral Pike is in position now, too. Engage thrusters and enter the relay, and may God be with us all," he said and braced himself in his chair. The plan was simple. The Ascended Co had their power centered around 4 populated systems, supported by 2 systems of energy collectors. Each of the Co positions would be attacked by a Terran armada, and when superiority had been achieved over their worlds, the ground troops would follow and land on the same day, thus preventing any attempt at mustering a firm defense and ending their independence within 3 months of the declaration of war. Was there anyone who supported this plan? Admiral Nelson asked himself, and no names came to mind. The plan developed by the leaders of the fleet was more conservative. Lure the Co into a prepared position with established citadels, have a single amalgamated fleet on hand, destroy them, and then counter-invade, leapfrogging from world to world to destroy their ability to build ships, then bombard the Co into submission without landing any soldiers other than xenomorphs, and begin occupying their logistical centers until they gave in. Not bold enough. Those 3 words had damned the plan then and there, and instead they had President McNamara's plan to execute. The blur of light seemed to go on for only minutes. when in truth, outside of the faster-than-light line, weeks had passed. And when that blur of light vanished to reveal the burning ancient sun and the blackness of space, Admiral Nelson said one thing and thought another. "Fire!" he shouted, while he thought, "Forgive us." For in front of him was an arrayed fleet of 100 vessels, some of them more massive than the flagship of his armada. The Terran ships scrambled, long-range guns fired 1,000 missiles. The smaller ships raced in, unleashing hell itself in short-range fire, while the larger ships at a more languid pace did what they could to support their smaller comrades. The bright light of dying ships was blinding to the eye, and the courage of the Terran Republic's sailors earned them their places in the storied history of their people. But from the very first shot of both armadas, the end was clear. "Signal the Marines! They have to withdraw, we can buy them time!" Admiral Nelson shouted to the comm station. "Divert all power to forward weapons array, forget the engines, there's no getting out of here. It is victory or death for us." He roared as the ship shook around him as vessels began to die in turn. Behind him, the fleet of helpless troop transports began to wheel about. It would take hours for them to prime their engines to enter the relay line again, and if they failed, if the got through, it'll be a massacre. Admiral Nelson could already hear the wailing of the bereaved in his head, and nor was he alone. As if the very ship he guided shared his sense of pity, it held up. The withering fire of the battered at the shields and then at the armor, but one by one the vessels died. Just nowhere near as fast as those of his fleet. Minute died birthing minute, hour died birthing hour, and the battle raged on. "Target their starbase, draw their fire toward us. We just need a few more minutes," he shouted as the ship began to rattle and damage reports began flowing in. The transponder signals vanished as the transports jumped to warp, and Admiral Nelson smashed the all-comm line. "All ships, retreat. That is an order. Retreat!" There were few enough left to listen to the order, but for one glorious moment, it seemed less than futile. The citadel of the ascended began to list. Pieces of it began to break off, and fires erupted in 1,000 places before, in one glorious nova-like moment, it erupted into a blinding white light that reminded Admiral Nelson of the very first time he'd gone to warp and seen the blur of space passing by. His mind flew back to his childhood. "I want to go into space someday," he'd shouted to his class when asked to speak of his future career. "That's a dangerous job. You have to be very brave to do that." His teacher's answer brought a smile to the face of the young boy. "Don't worry, I will be. I promise." He'd answered, and the teacher chuckled to themselves before calling on the next child to come up and share their future hopes. And in that moment, Admiral Nelson's ship erupted. There was no more light when he proved his childhood self right. Of the 150 Republic ships to venture into space that day, only 27 returned, and of those only 9 were considered combat-ready. And except for one armada, the others were no better off. Across the Republic networks, the story spread like wildfire. 100,000 dead in triple massacres. President McNamara stared dumbly at the headline streaming across the screen. It ran on a loop, and he willed it to be different each time, but it stubbornly refused to change no matter how he cursed or what he thought or what he wanted. When he finally accepted that the words were going to refuse his will that they change, he muttered only, "Who will take the blame for this one?" "I still can't believe it," Admiral Pike said to the surviving squadron commanders whose holograms sat around her conference room table. Their faint light flickered as those damaged ships were still struggling to repair the relays. Nobody argued with her. The attack had been a spectacular failure. "Dividing our forces was a bad call," one captain said with disgust. "We had our orders," another retorted with a sharp retort. But his response was not met with the rumble of agreement or support that he expected, not even from their own admiral. "How much of Nelson's fleet survived?" she asked instead. And as rebukes went, it was vicious. 9% survived. They might have been higher, as much as 15 or even 20%. But they continued to hold the line until the troop ships could get to warp and withdraw. It will take a year to repair the damaged ships if we do so on the move. And our own casualties are in excess of 60%. We'd be just as badly off if the lead ship of the ground forces hadn't suffered an engine malfunction. Susan swallowed the lump in her throat as the sheer madness of scale began to sink in. "And what about Admiral Yi?" she asked. "They are at full strength. An engine problem forced a delay with the flagship, and he chose to hold his entire armada back." Her first officer reported from where he stood against the wall. His hand went up and swiped the casualty list away to replace it with the reports, and brought up the tertiary information that was sent and deprioritized by the AI system. A 3-day delay? She pursed her lips together to keep from frowning. 3 days are nothing in interstellar travel. They may as well be seconds. The system would have deprioritized that, which would mean nobody would really notice. Oh, you son of a bitch. She wasn't even angry at him for doing it, more at herself for not having done the same. Admiral Yi had not been the only one to oppose the talks of military conflict against the Ko, but he had been the absolutely most strident in doing so, and when he did so, he often cited ancient texts that most dismissed. We know not our enemy as we know ourselves, and therefore we will win as often as we lose. We have no allies to join hands with. If we cannot gain the support of their neighbors in the stellar south, they will oppose us and supply our enemies for profit, and all the forces of the Ko will be pitted against us. There are no places of theirs that are weak to attack, but we are weak in many places still. If we try to defend everywhere will we be weak, but they need only defend a few places while they are able to strike at many. We will alarm our neighbors if we start a pointless war. Each will ask which of them is next. We would do better if we must fight. Draw them to us. Use their arrogance to attack a concentrated position. Destroy them in one blow. And then we can present ourselves truthfully as the victims of aggression. The nations around us will at least not support our enemies. All words found only deaf ears. But Susan, unlike most of the others, recognized the sources of the eccentric genius who rocketed to the top of the military hierarchy by defeating the Kobayashi Maru simulation. His victory then had inspired her to read the sources of his own inspiration, and the ancient primers of war that most ignored as outdated from Bronze Age times, put words to concepts that were known without being recognized as being known at all. Once laid out, she understood exactly what he'd done, and what he had hinted at to her and the other admirals. Send Admiral Yi a transmission, tell him, you were right. I expect I'll hear from him soon. Until then, keep up the mobile repairs on all ships, and we need to keep moving. If they chase us with even half their numbers, we're all as good as dead. Ma'am, her first mate said and sent the order as the planning meeting resumed. Admiral Yi held his fleet's position in the unoccupied system. The casualty report was still scrolling across his screen, and a sense of disgust at the sheer waste settled in his gut. His stoic face revealed none of his thoughts as the voice of the president screaming at him continued. I gave an order. You will obey that order. Attack. You do what I say do. Our transmissions are unclear, Mr. President. We are hearing only static. The admiral lied. It must be the solar flares. He then killed the transmission and took a gentle breath. Better to be led by a wise sheep than a foolish lion. Sir, was that wise? His first officer asked, and the admiral answered promptly. Yes. I was given the Admiralty to win, not to die gloriously. The President's motives are to boost his poll numbers with a quick victory to overshadow the death of Admiral Nelson and most of his fleet. Having been given the commission of Master of my fleet, there are some orders I am unable to obey. I see, sir, but then what do we do? She asked. A hint of relief lay poorly hidden in her voice, and not for nothing was it there. So many ships destroyed or damaged, so many lives lost, and the totals were still growing as the wounded continued to join the dead. Have we received a transmission from Admiral Pike? He asked, without looking away from the scrolling report. She sent a transmission saying only you were right, and we've heard nothing since. The first officer replied, and Admiral Yi's chin drooped a little. Send a reply telling her to link up with us. From now on, reroute all transmissions from the President into your comm. My priority communications will now be limited only to the other fleets, intelligence agencies, or localized planetary governments. The war may have been ill-advised, but we have an obligation now to not lose it. Begging your pardon, Admiral, but don't you mean an obligation to win it? His first officer asked, and true to his quick nature, the Admiral answered abruptly. I said what I said. President McNamara stared at the collective of holographic faces. They stared back at him from the human to the close but not quite human, to the alien, to the beyond bizarre. You sought our support, Mr. President, but we laid out a specific condition for this support, and you have been promising for weeks to meet it without doing so. Behind the President sat the leaders of the various Republic species. from the Sacred Dark, who now comprised the highest percentage of conscientious objectors in the Republic out of any species, to the Intakana under Rorona Jan, even the ones known commonly still as fiends, had their representatives, the grandchild of the one-time matriarch of the First State, to fall under the sway of the Terran Republic. It is true, but the investigation into the nature and causes of those acts involved classified information about the weapons involved. John said, keeping his case carefully neutral. He neither smiled nor frowned nor moved anything but his lips when he spoke. Then our economic and military aid will not come. The one to speak up was, gallingly enough, a fairly minor neighbor state. Karshinin? John tried to recall. The triviality of the name of the nation simply didn't matter, not as long as he got his way, but he was not getting his way. The Karshin state held his long neck forward, stretching it almost half the length of a giraffe. We will maintain trade, but we will not support a war that does not need to be waged, just for the sake of what could just as easily be a lie as the truth. Not every species could suck in their breath to express shock, but those who could, did. John's cheeks reddened. We're getting sidetracked. You are our allies. All I ask is that you act like it. Rorona kept his face as neutral as that of the president, but his mind was racing. John McNamara continued talking, but it was nonsense. Claims of mass slaughter on other worlds was nonsense. They're slaughtering our children by the thousand. They're forcing our people from their homes and replacing us. Do you want to live beside the Co if they get rid of us? It's absurd. The Co didn't even practice genocide in the last war, and everybody knows it. They go exactly as far as they must and no farther. It's like he thinks if he just says things, that's enough reason to believe him. Rorona glanced at the array of other leaders left and right. They no doubt felt the same as he. We're props, not people to him, to show that the Republic is more than just humans. It galled him, but the meeting offered an unlooked-for opportunity. He stood, and when the other neighboring national leaders and ambassadors turned their attention to him, John noticed and looked over his shoulder. Things are getting heated and distracted, Rorona said, and spread out his arms as he stepped forward and placed a hand on the president's upper back. The point our esteemed president was making is that there are obligations that have not been met and should have been, whether the war was on or not. So as a compromise, for now at least, suppose we just negotiate for an increased trade in mineral resources and some broad-spectrum used products that won't create diplomatic friction. More microchips, lower tariffs, and allow volunteers to travel to the Republic for service if they wish. Rorona's compromise suggestion had its intended effect. And within a matter of hours, the bones of an agreement were hammered out, and one by one the blue holographic faces of the many border state leaders of the massive Terran Republic were gone, leaving only a galactic map with its seemingly endless spiral around the black hole continuing unabated. Well done, Mr. President. Rorona praised the man at once. I could never have managed that, he said, and made a close approximation of a human laugh of relief and a pretense of wiping sweat from his brow. Whatever he intended to say, John did not say it. He only stiffened his proud posture. Yes, it was. I'm glad you at least recognize that, he said, and after a few short pleasantries nobody would remember, the president departed and the other species leaders stood up to go. I am impressed, Shannik of the Fiends said as she approached, but uncertain of your motives. You do not agree with him, but you help him. Her bright wings fluttered gently when she spoke, and the long tongue-like appendage in the center of her face curled and extended in an almost nervous fashion. The Fiends, having been the first people to fall, had suffered the greatest cultural shock out of any species, not least because they were the only one whose head of state had been imprisoned on Earth until the end of her life, though she had been allowed to have offspring who were allowed home in their own time. But more than that, they were the only ones to have nearly destroyed themselves first, having rioted and burned great cities during the Terran blockade. As a result, bold actions and aggression became cultural taboos in subsequent generations. If our neighbors volunteer to fight, the president will not call for volunteers among us. Even if the late President Brown was a man of unrivaled conviction to equality, we know not all humans are like him. I'd rather not see a 10,000% increase in recruiting stations among my people in the hopes that humans will have less interest in our lives than their own. Rorona's explanation cut to the heart of their collective concerns, and while they walked out of the building, the line became a cluster of regional governors with himself as the center. We can't avoid this war, and no, I think trying for independence is a horrible idea. Even altogether, we couldn't defeat the humans. They won't stand by as the Republic fractures. Instead, Rorona paused on the stairs and looked up over his shoulder toward the top of the great broad building with its dome and broad flag flapping in the wind. We should be thinking of the next election. The next election? Shannak asked. Her body bobbed as it hovered. You have a human in mind to support? Another great man like John Brown? It was no surprise to him that she named that one specifically. His alien integration and alien acceptance policies had made him a hero in the myriad species that made up the Republic. Humans remembered him as the wise and powerful leader who carried the Republic through a terrible war. Aliens remembered him as the face of liberty. But Rorona shook his head. No, not a human, he answered, and held still and silent as the implications of his words sank in. Admiral Yi's expression was stern, far from the almost boyish joy he once took at seeing the vast openness of space. With his communications equipment broken except for the short-range comms used to keep contact with Admiral Pike, he had a temporarily free hand, or at least free in the sense that he could not receive timely orders from the President. Status report, repairs. He gave the order to the computer, and a moment later the screen changed from a view of the stars to a categorized view of ships showing the various design models, names, and the percentage repairs underway. While Admiral Nelson had died in battle, saving countless lives, his ship had been able to make it to warp with the bridge, suffering the worst damage. That at least had one happy benefit to the fleet. The flagship had the molecular assembler, which allowed the creation of parts, the repair of ships, and even the construction of new ones on the move. As long as they were near a star, planet, or asteroids, they had material for conversion. Little by little, they were undergoing repairs. In the meantime, a transmission swept the report aside, and Admiral Pike's face appeared on screen. Admiral, my scout ships have reported the Co are following, just as I predicted. Good, was all he said. Is it really wise to let them get this deep into our border territory? It's true we're far stellar south, but even so, she shook her head. This region of space had the lowest population of the Terran Republic, but it was nonetheless a half-mad gamble to just give up territory. Space does not bleed, was all he said before she killed the link. While their engines might not have been as good as those of the Co, they were good enough, and the Co were methodical in a way that made the most scrupulous and anal-retentive Terran bureaucrat look reckless. Leaving behind one malfunctioning mine or setting off one trap would cause them to be delayed for days or even weeks, allowing the armada of man to move farther away and further the repairs and construction of replacement vessels, which would then be staffed by new fleet officers from the alien species of the Republic who graduated from fleet academies in their space. Whatever happens in this foolish war, the Republic will never be the same, Admiral Yi told himself and sat down again. I dislike fighting humans. They do not know the truth of their place, Admiral Kitska said as he watched the small flotilla of Terran militia ships scramble. They were clearly meant more to deal with pirates and rogue slavers than serious people, but even so, they were uncommonly brave. As do I, the one-eyed Vice Admiral Lakhni replied, and reached up to touch the wayward stalk that was now missing his eye. While it could have been replaced with a prosthetic, Lakhni's house came from the rejectionist school of thought which accepted anything that happened to the body as the will of the universe. But that did not mean he didn't miss what was lost. You lost that to them, did you not? Kitska asked, a faint touch of sympathy in his voice. I did. On a ground action, a planet I do not know the name, but it held many of their former men of war. His voice fell away as his knowing began. The knowing was, as they now understood, the product of chemical hallucinogens that, when taken in by others, allowed them to guide their minds through a story with perfect understanding. It effectively allowed another to live out the thoughts of others, and it was how the Co first found themselves revered as gods to other species. In their most distant past, they believed it to be the proof of their souls, and in the less distant past, proof of their godhood. But in the now, it was a useful tool for important matters where misunderstandings could not be afforded as a consequence of the vagaries of speech. Kitska felt the ground beneath his feet. It was soft, and the grass was as blue as the sky. The air was cool, but his field effect combat suit kept the temperature close to his body comfortable enough. They have to be around here somewhere. Our sensor tech is vastly superior to the counter tech of these primates. Where could they be? An explosion drew their attention to the west, followed quickly by the howls of pain from one of their heavy infantry. "Medic!" Kitska shouted as drops of purple blood spattered against his suit. Bits of flesh from the unfortunate one's legs were everywhere. The suit's automedic function was limited. It could stop bleeding, it could cauterize a wound and administer pain medication, but nothing could replace the skill of a trained expert. What was that? Who shouted the question was uncertain, but guns went up to the ready and auto-target features found only various animals. Another blast went off, another scream erupted, another leg was turned into mush. "The ground! They've mined the ground!" Kitska cried as he saw the hole beneath the ruined leg beside the wailing unfortunate. How did they—" He did not get the question out when his eye stalk fell at his feet, and he could only hear his own screaming. The hallucinated memory vanished at once, and he shuddered before reaching up to touch both his eyes and make sure they were where they were supposed to be. Lakni answered the unspoken question. The rest is just as bad. They had urinated on the sensors meant to detect their numbers on the basis of fluid discharge, thus making us think large numbers were gathered up. They then used primitive minds that were so basic that we would not detect them with electronic equipment, and my eye? He reached up and touched the ruined stalk. The animals were humans in disguise. They created facsimiles and cut out a hole for a sniper rifle. I was lucky to only lose my eye. Kamkros lost his life to that bullet. The area was littered with traps. Spiked pits smeared with excrement that would sicken us. Our own body weight and the weight of our equipment helped to end our lives. Our shields protected us from energy weapons, but simple kinetic primitiveness. It galled us. Every stalk of grass hid a new nightmare. These are not a race like any we have encountered, and I fear we err greatly if we attack too strongly, sir. Admiral Kitska said nothing for a long time. The dissipation of the illusion had been a mercy. To experience those agonies was as horrifying as the knowing used in mating was pleasurable. When he spoke, however, he made his intention plain. I will not say you are wrong to feel as you do, but they have brought war to us, so fight them we will, and if enough of them die, they will eventually stay home. Rorona Jean, governor of the territory once known as the Inta Kana Confederation, enjoyed something few other governors of the Terran Republic ever did. He had the unique position of being a former enemy who had earned the trust of his conquerors. With his cousins both dead for different reasons and conveniently taking the blame for everything, he also had a clean slate to work with. And to that end, in the years between the end of the war and the present, Rorona's adaptable mind had turned itself to winning over the Terran population, as well as other significantly influential leaders of trade in industry, finance, and agriculture. Terran soldiers received subsidized tourist packages, and even the once oppressed Kana were given generous offers of land and machinery to work it as a form of reparations that, if it did not completely end the old hatred, at least showed sincerity in the attempt to mend fences and build bridges. As such, his people thrived and enjoyed far more favorable relations with the Republic's many peoples than some. John Brown was a wiser man than anyone really knew, Rorona thought as he looked over the latest poll numbers. The blue and red lines reflected support levels for various candidates across the Republic, and most especially, he noticed that neither pro- or anti-war positions seemed to influence who was winning and where. I have destroyed my enemies when I make them my friends, he muttered the words again and flipped to the latest casualty reports. What could be worse for a people than to have the rule of a wise man followed by a fool? Rorona asked himself while he watched the numbers scroll across the screen, and with a few gestures of his hands there came the various speeches. The war wasn't desperate, not like the last one. It wasn't at the forefront of the Terrans' minds, not yet. It was far removed from their lives, something that happened on the frontier. It couldn't endanger the core worlds or the more distant alien populations. Not yet. Rorona tapped over to the finance reports for his region. The Terran Republic put a shocking amount of energy and resources into reconstruction, and their tax structure allocated a sizable sum for localized projects. A few new shipyards can be justified by trade, but used for anything. He thought again as he ran his finger across the star map. The Co cared nothing for their worshippers, not really, but the large-scale abandonment by those worshippers after the defeat in the last conflict had no doubt offended them, and they were only a dozen jumps from the outskirts of his space. I need to be prepared either to build our own defenses or to support the fleet when it arrives here. Perhaps the Terrans won't despair in times of horror, but I cannot say we will not." His grim thoughts brought a shudder to his body, and he ordered construction fleets to the outlying systems. The Co were methodical. If they came his way, they would attack every installation, even something as worthless as a lone mining station or energy harvesting center. It would buy time, even if only a few months, to put a little bait in their way, and that might prove all the difference if it was needed. Admiral Susan Pike held her breath and watched as the new battleship was released from the launching clamps and began to float in space. The new crew was made up mostly of Kana and Inta-Kana volunteers, as they made up the bulk of the nearest populations. A handful of humans were on board as well, but they were, for the first time in history, minorities on their own starships. It was far from the only vessel with a situation like that. 3 other ships had already been built and staffed in the same way. At the same moment that the new ship's engines began to fire up, a freshly repaired vessel followed and floated away from the repair bay to join its new sister in the void. No sooner did that happen than repairs began on another ship, and the construction of a new vessel began beside it. Little by little our strength is being restored. May it never be wasted again, even if it is different, she muttered under her breath while she stared at the monitor and watched it all happen from the bridge of her flagship. "Ma'am?" one of her officers asked, but she waved it away with a gesture of her hand. "It's nothing, just talking to myself," she answered and waited for word from Admiral Yi. "They only have 6 worlds!" President McNamara shouted and grabbed his hair with both hands. He tore at it with anger and felt several strands come loose from his scalp. "We beat them once already. Why are we losing now?" He raged at nothing, no one, everyone, everything, all while he was alone except for his AI assistant. "Every Co vessel is worth 20 ships by power ratio. Our technological inferiority makes their size irrelevant," the feminine computerized voice repeated. It was the 4th time that day he'd heard that answer, and he still could not accept it. "This just can't be," he raged. The casualties were widely spread, so much so that it was little recognized how truly massive the numbers of dead soldiers were. Thanks to his respect for the dead bill, casualty notices were limited to individual families, and thanks to communications blackouts, the loss of frontier colonies was not really felt yet. But something had to change. On his desk there sat a single document, a document that would change everything. "We've never done a draft before, but frankly it's time. I just can't let my party lose the human vote." And then it hit him. He tapped the digital document and dictated his amendment. Draftees to be taken from regions prioritized by economic contribution from smallest to largest, given that human worlds were still far and away the most prosperous. It had the effect of drafting soldiers from non-human species, poorer worlds with lower representation and less significance in voting, and less able to lobby for a change to the system. Perfect. This will give us enough soldiers, won't cause much of an uproar at home, and all my problems will be solved. He told himself and sent it off for a final vote with a smile resting smugly on his face. Sergeant Mark Xanthak Carney inhaled deeply. The ridges on his blue forehead ached. That was typical of his species, or so he was told. But his knowledge on that subject was largely academic, having learned it from books and from his adoptive parents. It was a consequence of his species' version of adrenal secretions that gave large bursts of strength and pain resistance. "Humans are lucky not to have to deal with these headaches," he thought as the blasts roared outside. They were a relief in a way. The Co seemed oblivious to human improvements in technology, so their once precision weapons were now starting to miss more and more often. He poked his head out of his foxhole and looked toward one of the soft targets, the decoys set up to give the illusion of success. They were little better than old pillbox designs, things hastily constructed out of available concrete material, but their contents included just a few simple heaters with temperatures set to mimic that of humans. It burst into flames and nobody bothered to put it out. There was no point. Whatever was in the weapons the Co used, it was going to burn until it ran out. Nothing short of burying it would do, and rumor had it that if you walked over a burial site, the ground was hot there, as if it were still on fire. "Fuck the draft," Private Lanker snarled. It was a common enough sentiment, especially on the frontier where draftees were sent to fight. The xenomorph handlers stayed back in the safety of underground bunkers, but out here there were few enough of those. They were reserved for defending or retaking the more important worlds. A blue light shot overhead, and Mark dove out of the way as it cut through his frontal barrier like a knife through butter, and Lancor's bulbous alien body was still for a moment. Mark wasn't sure how well he could read the emotions on the alien's face, but it seemed shocked. Did he not see it coming? This has been happening for weeks now. Why is he? The question died before he could ask it, as the two halves of Lancor began to fall away from one another, having been cut in half by the overhead beam. Blue and green organs tumbled here and there as the perfectly divided recruit understood what happened to him in his final moments. Whether each half of his brain understood it or not, that was a question for medical professionals that Mark had no time to consult. "Here they come!" he shouted, thanking the universe that those blue beams seemed to take a long time to recharge, and that the Co were predictable in following up their use with ground and artillery assaults. His call was echoed by others who drowned out the screams of the wounded and the grief of survivors, and they, as he, raised their weapons and fired. "Call up the xenomorphs!" somebody shouted, and Mark felt the pent-up tension release as he fired his rifle into the oncoming ranks of the Co heavy infantry. They fired in turn, breaking into clusters on foot while their faster vehicles raced along in between on hover vehicles vastly more maneuverable than their human counterparts. A hovercraft lit up a tight position in a firefight, racing to get around a spot that seemed less defended, only to hit the first trap and go flying. The hover vehicles relied on keeping distance to the ground. If the ground fell away and ceased to be solid, it was as good as crashing into a wall. The trap. A pit filled with water that had been dyed to match the ground. The Co, it seemed, needed to breathe just like any other living thing, and the occupants tumbled mostly into the water. The vehicle disappeared out of view, and the occupants flailed only for a moment. One of their larger members, the one manning the large gun, flew past the water, hit the ground, and was promptly shot at close range by a Sacred Dark and a Yidiaxa. The body did not move. He was the lucky one, as near as Mark could tell. The others sank into the water. The bubbles lasted for long enough that Mark did not see them stop. "If I die, let it not be that way," he thought, and watched the vehicles wheel around. Most of the co-drivers were more experienced now. They wouldn't take advantage of obvious openings, fearing the mischief of the Terran Republic military. He gritted his teeth. The Co kept falling. But they died not by themselves. Others of his people fell around him. "If we're going to die, then we drown them in our blood first." Mark bellowed his defiance as an energy strike hit his hand, and he felt the searing pain and burning flesh that his protective gear was not quite good enough to protect against. "Drown them!" The rallying cry went up. "Drown them! Drown them! Drown them!" It took on an airy, nightmarish rhythm that seemed to shock the Co as if they understood they fought not individuals but a single whole, and in that moment of hesitation the courage of a people calling themselves gods faltered. They fell back. The haze of smoke and noise of explosions continued, and Mark paused to check his hand. The smell of burning flesh was thick in his nostrils as his body spasmed with the pain. Unlike humans, his adrenal secretions did not provide the kind of perfect ignorance to injury, though it did make him stronger, and it would last longer because of the pain. The pause bought them time to reorganize, and Mark ran from his position to the next layer of defenses, closer to the core of their position. As he ran, he felt the heat and dust kick up. Somebody, somewhere, some worthless, self-styled god had him in their sights. If he were using auto-targeting, I'd be dead now. Mark understood and wondered whether it was one of the good ones who took no pleasure in killing and was just driving him away, or a cruel one, shooting for sport and missing just because his pride was greater than his ability. "Where are the damn xenomorphs?" Mark shouted and yanked off his helmet and threw it hard on the ground at his feet. It wobbled as he barked his question, and there was no clear answer for several seconds. Xenomorphs were an instrumental part of war. The modified creatures, controlled by remote handlers, were one of the few advantages the Terran Republic had over almost every other people in war, including the Co. They could rip through vehicles as easily as flesh, had no mercy, perfect loyalty, and speed equal to or surpassing the Co fighting vehicles. Fighting without them was just throwing away lives. Mark touched his temple where the pain grew as his body prepared itself for another desperate exertion when the answer, "They're being held back until the evacuation is ready," reached his ears. Evacuation? That was good news. This planet doesn't have much here, just a handful of small towns, not even a city. It's so new. So why are we even bothering to hold on like this? Are we buying time? For what? The question lingered. Whatever could be said of the Co, even if they didn't value human lives or any lives, they also didn't go out of their way to exterminate them. It just seemed so damn pointless, holding here for weeks, dying over a patch of dirt on the frontier. He didn't get to finish the thought before one of the sacred dark shouted a warning. "They're coming back!" The roar of guns of such variety that none could have identified them all sent blasts of energy as well as kinetic death back and forth. Vehicles roared as the Co, reinforced or replaced by fresh numbers, began to approach their position. Mark held his rifle in his burned hand and fired and fired. Fear and pain mingled into one emotion while he shouted his defiance at the alien horde. The cluster formations of Co infantry groups were easy targets at least, even if they did die hard. He felt another searing sensation on his body, his leg, his hip, his other hand. It's bad, how bad? Is it really bad or just kind of bad? He wondered, but he had no time to check as the first Co reached his position, and his adrenal burst kicked in earnest. He swung his rifle like a club and hit the Co directly in the face. It caved, crumpling in on itself, and the body tumbled back, unmoving. He was not the last. Hand-to-hand fighting was going on in a dozen places, and whether they liked being drafted or not, none were prepared to die easily that day. Sacred Dark aided Idiaksa, Kana aided Intakana, Vaxrashi like himself aided human. Their blood of every shade mingled in the dirt of the distant world, drowning out the color of the Co as they sought to hold their position for just a little longer. "Fall back!" The order came from somewhere. Mark couldn't see where. He was on his back, beneath the corpse of a dead Co. The sky was gray, overcast. The first drops of rain began to fall. "Fall back!" Mark heard it again and forced the body off of himself with a push. There were a dozen corpses around him, some his friends, most were not. But in that space he was briefly alone. The Co had been thrown back at least for one moment, but as he rose to his knees ready to stand again, he saw them reforming for another charge with yet more reinforcements unblooded and ready to go. "Fuck!" he cursed, saw as his fellow soldiers abandoned their positions. He made ready to move, but then he paused. "Double fuck!" he cursed under his breath. The banner of the Terran Republic was on a pole between where he stood and the next fallback spot. "Come on, you idiot!" someone shouted at him when they saw him freeze. Mark rushed to the pole as the noise of the Co went up at his back. "Cover me!" he shouted to his comrades in arms. His fingers trembled with pain, and as he feared, "This is bad." The bones were visible in places. The rest were charred and blackened. His breath raced as he fumbled with the line. The knot came loose as the blasts came closer. Standing alone, he was a prime target, and only the distortion equipment meant to disable short-range targeting kept him from being shot immediately to pieces. The more experienced Co, however, aimed manually, and Mark lurched forward with the force of a hit to his shoulder, and smelled the burning odor that proved it went clean through. "Forget it!" someone shouted from ahead of him at the next fallback position. Mark shut his eyes against the pain. His rush of strength redoubled and held him up as the flag came down, falling like a stone while his hands worked the rope. A blast missed him, cut the rope, and down it came tumbling into his waiting arms. He ran, and ran, and ran. Everything hurt. There was only pain. The cloth is very soft. It was an absurd thought to have, but it was the last one he managed before he felt himself flying through the air, propelled by some blast he hadn't even heard. He didn't feel the ground hit him when he landed. Sergeant Carney woke up with a splitting headache. "Ow," he moaned and reached up to touch the light blue ridges of his forehead. The pain in his hand hit him immediately, and he drew the hand away to look at the damage. In place of flesh, there was now a metal replacement. It was colored with a light blue material, but the way it moved and the faint ridges and lines beneath the coating was evidence enough of what lay there. Little by little, his memory returned. "Right, that," he said as his memory returned, and more of his body's sense of touch came with the passing seconds. The material under him was a stretched cloth, and the lights overhead were the steady blue glow used in hospitals to help create a sense of calm in patients. He lifted his other hand up in front of his eyes. It was gone too, also replaced with a high-end prosthetic. He then moved the scratchy green blanket from off his chest and inspected the places he remembered being wounded. His flesh was pockmarked with scars a shade lighter than his flesh, indicating that they'd used an MTC, a mobile cauterization tool to save his life. He then moved the blanket further. There was still a pain in his leg, but in a place there shouldn't have been, since the place where the pain was coming from had been amputated and replaced with another cybernetic prosthetic. "Oh, you're awake. Good for you," a human doctor with flecks of grey and a dark beard said and tapped on his mobile device, bringing up Mark's file. He whistled. "You were a doozy of a case, so congratulations. We weren't sure you'd make it." Doc, my leg, my shoulder, my hands. Why do they hurt?" The question came from Mark with a mix of dismay and frustration. "If I was going to lose them, the least my body could do is stop telling me they hurt." He told his brain, which agreed with him, but did nothing otherwise to stop the pain. "The shoulder pain should fade in a few hours. We took care of that with nanobots while you were unconscious. They reroute pain sensations as data to help you sleep, but their power lasts only so long, and as they die, that data is returned to your nerves. It will be a slow release, so it shouldn't be crippling, but it will hurt till probably 9 a.m. tomorrow. The rest, that is what we call phantom pain. It will go away in time. Your brain hasn't registered that those parts are gone. I'm sorry, there's not much we can do. The opiatic medication we would use for your species is in short supply, but we did what we could." Mark nodded with a numb sense of understanding. "And when I go home, can I, grow replacement limbs, get my body back how it was?" The doctor slowly shook his head. "I'm sorry, no. The MTC fried the nerve endings. We'd have to amputate further to living tissue to attach replacements, and growing those organs takes months." A grim quiet came over the little room, disrupted only by the noise of beeps and voices in the other small rooms. The stale, recycled air bore the faint scent of alcohol, ointment, and sweat, and after the moment stretched out for too long, the doctor added, "Congratulations, though. You've been nominated by your commander for a Medal of Honor." I was." Mark reached up and rubbed his forehead again. The news did nothing for his headache, and he tried to recall the final minutes of the battle. The doctor did not leave him in confusion. "Yes, you stayed and saved the colors from being captured by the Co. Ran them all the way back to the lines under enemy fire, and evidently that was after you were the last to withdraw from your forward position after leveling suppressive fire on the advancing Co-mobile infantry." He whistled again. "It also says that you are personally responsible for killing at least 9 Co-infantry, including 2 in close combat. Son, if that all doesn't deserve a medal, I don't know what does." Mark found nothing to smile about in that. As his memory returned, he recalled the dead comrades on the forward lines, the futile fight that never had a real chance of being won. All the years of life from all the people who were given up to buy the Republic only a few weeks or a few days at worst. "I see," was all he could muster. "So, where am I now? Are we planetside or—" Even while he asked, he knew that couldn't be the case. "No, the remainder of your unit managed to get on board the transport ship and launch before the Co could get close. A lot of them died in the self-destruct, if that makes you feel any better." The doctor's words did not make Sergeant Carney feel any better. "And where are we going?" Mark asked, a sense of dread already stirring in his liver. "To the next world, to link up with other units and hold the Co back a little longer there." The doctor's tone became one of bitter frustration, and Mark looked at him a little differently at that, seeing the man more haggard than he had initially. "I'm sorry," he added and lowered his eyes. "But you're not going home to recuperate. Nobody is except those on death's door." Mark closed his eyes. Somehow he knew that was going to happen. "I'll do my best to try not to visit you again." Mark tried to crack a smile, and the doctor's passive expression finally cracked enough to at least attempt to give one in return. "I'd rather more people end up where you are than in those plastic bags. But try to avoid both if you can. For now, though, this is the best I can do," he said and approached a metal tank. He removed a mask with a long plastic tube, put it over Mark's face, and as Mark breathed, he began to slip into a dreamless, healing sleep. President McNamara looked at the paperwork on his desk. A Medal of Honor winner? Among aliens? The first one actually nominated. He rubbed his jaw as he thought it over. Would it be good to have one of their kind win it and enhance morale? Or would it just make the war look worse? Plus, I haven't had a human nominee yet. He set the nomination aside. It didn't feel like the right move. The next items on the agenda were budget proposals. The cost of care for the wounded was ballooning as their numbers grew. Battleships or bandages? The question came to mind, and while he contemplated it, a notice from the Bavragan mercenaries appeared, offering to sell war material at a steep discount. He pursed his lips. He had little doubt that the material was stolen, either from neighbor states or from the Republic's own miners. It's cheaper to buy it from them than it would be to pay for the mining operations. It would have the knock-on effect of keeping the mercenaries neutral, and the decision was made. He wrote a much lower counter-proposal to the cost of medical care for the injured veterans and requested shuffled funds over to the purchase of military supplies and raw materials from the mercenary group. With his party holding a majority, passage on his terms was assured. But with elections not that far away, there was that creeping, ugly knowledge. We need a victory, and soon. And with that, he signed off on a draft roll increase for the fleet and for the ground forces. The xenomorphs were better, but the draft was cheaper, and the dead cost nothing. And so he sent the increase request off with the thought, even if we win by drowning the Co in our blood, history will only remember that I won. I can live with that. Rorona Jean waved from the high dais above the mob. The mountain that served as the seat of government for generations, back before the Intakana had even left their planet for the first time, had a large outcropping of stone that stretched out above the city's highest buildings. In the early days, a complex set of mirrors, marvels of ancient engineering, allowed the people below to look at their leader as if he was only a few paces away. Now, the old mirrors were gone, and holocams projected his visage up close, and his full body at range and every conceivable angle, to a system of monitors in the city center, as well as across what was now the region of space Rorona Jean ruled as governor. His territory was reduced, as the former Confederation member states now had their own territories with guidance from the Republic federal authorities. But thanks to his timely surrender years before, his reach was still extensive, making the former Confederation masters the largest region of the Republic, and the species with the largest numbers after human. That was reflected by the concurrent viewer numbers Rorona could see out of his augmented reality chip. Over 160 billion were now watching, and with luck, perhaps this will draw some favorable attention our way when the broadcast goes out. People of the Republic, he said with his arms outstretched as if to welcome every individual into his embrace, and a quiet voice full of resolve, matched as close as possible to the timbre of the voice the late John Brown used, almost fatherly in his urgency and encouragement, and his choice of words would appeal to many, many more than just his own species. Thanks to the aid packages of the Liberator and his own careful reforms in education, the prevailing view was that his people were as much a part of the Republic as their former conquerors, and so he held their every ear. Today I announce the opening of a dozen new shipyards, places dedicated to the principles of our liberation, dedicated to the security of our territory. As he said it, the great map, not of the former Confederation territory alone, but of the entire Republic, appeared behind him. And to the future we have every right to defend. The Co were never gods. They were our oppressors. They were the ones who set us on this course. Emperors past were never called to account for their crimes because they believed and compelled all others to believe that gods could not be questioned. And if the gods allowed those crimes of old to last into the present, who were we to question it? They were fools not to, he said with a quiet whisper, and let the memories linger, the frequent Kana rebellions, the slave narratives that flew about in the forms of autobiographies, dramas, tragedies, plays, films, and shows, did no favors to those few who wanted a return to the old order, and his cousins and their ancestors drew more black marks on their eternal names in the minds of listeners. Our fleets will rise. Our people will defend our homes, from here to earth, from here to the heartlands of the Co. We will spend trillions on defense, but not one credit for tribute. We are strong, and we are brave, and we will never be beaten again. As he shouted the last phrase, the background image shifted to show a dozen ship engines flaring to life and a dozen shipyards all lighting up in unison, revealing beneath the bright lights tens of thousands of crew all shouting in unison before giving a sharp turn and marching into the ships of war that were built with great difficulty on shipyards that were themselves being built at the same time. It made for a far more dramatic visual than just the shipyards alone. And as the crowd roared on, the ships began to slip from their docks and then warped away at high speed, onward to whatever death or glory awaited them, but also into the imaginations of countless billions in his own territory, and likely far beyond. I wonder how it will be received on Earth, Rorona thought to himself as he waved to the cheering mob. His region now had more shipyards than the Sol and Alpha Centauri, though with the mega shipyard at Alpha Centauri expanding, it was a close count. The funding for it was provided almost exclusively by his own taxes after years of austerity measures. But it proved worth it. Federal wages from the Republic will pour into our accounts. Our volunteers will offset any draft, and it should help get rid of any lingering human resentment toward us. My speech won't endear me to the Co, but what was that human phrase? Oh yes, they can go die in a fire. Yes, that was it. And he felt quite good saying it, even if it were only to himself. Humans do have the best curses out of any species in the galaxy. He mused as the ceremony came to a close. Admiral Pike braced herself. The Co-Armada pursuing Admiral Yi and the bulk of the combined fleet was, for now, her responsibility. The fleet she had in front of her was not made up of battleships, but mostly cruisers and smaller vessels that could be produced faster, or even swarms of frigates that could be produced en masse on the nearest inhabited systems, and some fly-by-night shipyards. It was a shoddy sight compared to the once grand fleet that first invaded Co-space. But it wasn't meant to be grand. She clenched her teeth. On screen, the bridges of the major ships appeared, and the skeleton crew came into view. Their uniforms were different. They wore short sleeves with the Republic flag tattooed on their arms with the phrase, "Born on Earth to die in the void," in big, bold letters just below it. "Ma'am," the various captains said in unison, "we're ready. Just keep our shields up and hit their incoming torpedoes as much as possible. We'll handle the rest." "Godspeed, soldier," she said, stood, and saluted them all. She looked over her shoulder at her chief of engineering. "Route all power to shield extension. Ready kinetics for missile and torpedo targeting." The Co-Armada replaced the view of the living dead. Defeating them was impossible, and she knew it, they knew it, and the damned crews on damned ships knew it. The flare of light that revealed the expanding shields was visible for just a moment, and they waited patiently as a mountain for the Co to close in. With superior numbers on their side, they would follow doctrine and engage the threat. She couldn't hear the orders to fire on the other ships, but she saw the blasts begin. Human energy weapons, thanks to the fruits of research into the formerly defeated Co-Armadas in the last war, were now longer range. New possibilities were in the works, new weapons, new shields and ships, new everything, while the Co remained unchanged. Still, longer range had a consequence of less power, and the Co-shields shrugged off the lances of light that briefly illuminated their shields, with the chief consequence being that they turned their attention to the long-range vessels first. Admiral Pike kept her hands clenched on the armrests of her chair. "Target their incoming fire. Nothing else. Focus shield extensions on the long-range ships." A rainbow of colors from various forms of energy and plasma shot back and forth within the void, but true to her role, her Dreadnought-class flagship acted purely in a support role, blasting torpedoes to space dust, shattering missiles and otherwise absorbing the worst damage. Frigate swarms raced out on the wings, and the Co began to learn the purpose of the shell of a fleet. They slammed into the ships, targeting the engines first and foremost and erupting in gouts of fiery death, expending all they had to make one tiny opening through which to smash. Susan winced at each eruption that represented the death of more of her own people. But it proved effective. Co ships were not built to withstand suicide runs, and they began to list in space, forcing their formation to adjust, and unwittingly exposing those who separated from the rest, to yet more runs as the larger ships came into play. Ships rocked and shook under the fire of nightmare. Terror sweat ran through every pore but the bravest and most foolish. Every breath was as good as the last in the heart and soul of each who took it, and the little battle raged toward its inevitable conclusion. The cruisers shunted off all weapons, killed life support, and set their ships toward their final targets. The death transmissions came on, voice only, with not even the power left for a visual. "This is it, ma'am. Get out of here and give them hell for us. Make sure it wasn't useless." "Bonsai, motherfuckers!" the nameless officer bellowed to the void, and that was that. She didn't know which captain said it, that would be found out later, and there was no chance to reply. He was probably already dead when that was sent anyway. She thought as the last life signs died on their monitors. "Full power to engines, get us out of here," she ordered, then added, "But keep on recording till the last moment. The Republic needs to see what heroism looks like." As her ship swung around toward the nearest hyperlane, The last cruiser exploded against the shields of a Ko vessel, and on zoom she could see Ko bodies flying out into the stars, dying in the void like those whose lives they'd already taken, sharing space with them in death that they never truly could in life. How much damage the ship had taken was unsure, but it hadn't died as the cruiser had. Still, it's amazing we lasted long enough to do that much. These designs are getting better all the time. As she thought that, the damage reports came in. For the little Terran Republic fleet, the losses were 99% for the Ko. One ship killed, but 25 seriously damaged. Her breath caught in her chest for a moment as time stretched out just before the hyperlane leap, and she saw it. Just as Ko doctrine dictated, they'd stopped to repair their fleet. At the cost of a few hundred lives from people whose families were paid massive sums, and the cost of a handful of partially readied suicide ships, the Ko were going to be delayed for 2 more months before they could even hit the next hyperlane. They don't even know we've won by losing. Not yet. Susan muttered under her breath and began to type a relay code to Admiral Yi about the results of his special command groups, letting him know they'd need a lot more of them, and fast. Mark rubbed his temple again and flexed his metallic hand. One of the fingers was missing, shot off by a stray beam. Only a few weeks of recovery, and now here he was on yet another world with another advancing group of Ko heavy infantry. Nearby, a young male of the Sacred Dark shook with fear. Another draftee. The male didn't sweat with fear the way humans did. He more oozed, a sticky substance that had one advantage. There was a small wound on his arm where a beam took off a chunk of flesh, and the ooze he secreted through his skin covered and hardened in the gap, ending the bleeding earlier than platelets would have on a human. Problem was, it stank. You could smell the fear of the Sacred Dark soldiers more than you could any of the other species. "Relax, kid, it'll be fine," Mark said and clapped him on the shoulder. It was a very human gesture, one he'd learned from his adoptive parents, but it was also one the Sacred Dark had come to learn themselves after substantial interaction with humans. He made a close approximation of a smile. "They won't be coming again this way for hours, and when they do, we're prepared. They're dumb as badly programmed machines, and we don't have to win. Just stay alive and buy time." He reassured the young male. They didn't have lips in the same way as he did, but rather small gaps that parted in sequence back and forth through which sounds were expelled. "Right, but do we have to do it from up here?" The soldier, a private as indicated by the rank on his chest, asked, and looked over the ridge and down at the valley below. It was a fair question. The infantry made easy targets down there, and the hover vehicles of the Ko were rendered useless on the sand, but the position was vulnerable to airstrikes and artillery, not to mention space targeting from blockading Ko ships. The caves behind them were a better spot. "Yes," Mark lied. He knew he lied, and it gnawed at his guts to do so. The truth was the kid was right. The nominally excellent position was more like a laser sponge, soaking up damage while slowing the Ko out, wearing them down before they could reach the next line of defenses. To distract himself, he looked around. That was the other problem. The only humans up with us are under some kind of punishment. Everyone else is a non-human draftee, or, like me, one of the ones who has been here for a while. First they turned down my medal, then they put me up here. He tried not to think about that, about either thing, but he was unsuccessful until the distant boom of Ko infantry dropships following their protocol and landing reinforcements out of range. "Take position!" he shouted, and with steady hands that contrasted with grim starkness, the obvious nervousness of the battle virgins that surrounded him, he made ready to fight. "I don't want to die," he thought while he leveled his rifle and prepared to do exactly that. "Then research it faster, you moron!" President McNamara bellowed at the scientists. "Do you think you can't be replaced? Do you think I can't see you're trying to make me look bad? You've had that technology in your hands since the last war ended. Why haven't you figured it out yet?" He slammed his fist on the desk and visibly winced, but beyond that he put his pain into anger. "I'm sorry, Mr. President, it's just... this is so far beyond anything we've ever worked with. Besides, we already have made great strides. Our propulsion tech is now almost twice as fast as 10 years ago, at least in the solar range. So we can go nowhere fast. Perfect. That'll win the damn war." The president snarled and spat on the floor of his office. "We need weapons. This was supposed to be a short, easy war, and we're losing. We suffered 9 million captured citizens and 200,000 dead yesterday. We can't keep this up. Are you even loyal to the Republic, Or did they buy you off? The president snapped, and the scientists on screen bristled as he glared at them. The lead scientist frowned. Nonsense, and what's more? He leaned over his own desk toward the projection of the president. You can go to hell. We didn't start this war. You wanted this. We warned you that our technology was not yet up to par with theirs, that we needed at least another 20 years to even grasp the principles of their technology, let alone implement it. It's not my fault you were so damn stupid that you couldn't listen to people smarter than you about how our jobs work. You don't get to come back to us and declare we're somehow to blame. If you have somebody who can do it better, hire them. Otherwise, fuck off. The shout echoed across the many worlds of the Republic and were fed directly to the president's ears through the transmission, and he stopped, stunned. How dare you speak to me that way? I am the president. You are an idiot, an egotistical, stupid, short-sighted buffoon. You aren't equal to your office, and this is all your fault. The scientist declared and straightened up. Crossing his arms in front of his chest, he spat across the desk onto the floor, matching the president's gesture of contempt from beat to beat. You! President McNamara's face turned an ugly shade of red as his fury rose, and he grasped for words to properly express his wrath. And when he found them, he unleashed them. You're fired! I'm revoking your clearance! Get out of that building! I'll have another scientist replacing you within the hour. Maybe that one will prove loyal, and you will be investigated for treason. The scientist snorted. Investigate away. I haven't done anything but call a moron, and that's not a crime. I just need to tell them what to find. It doesn't matter if it exists or not, it can still be found. The president scowled and glared at the team of scientists who stood frozen behind their lead researcher. The rest of you had better remember that. He then killed the transmission, and Dr. Manning Hatton took a slow, measured breath. He's a fucking toddler. We elected a fucking toddler. But sir, shouldn't you be worried? A junior scientist asked. He basically just promised he'd throw you in jail. Dr. Hatton shrugged. No, not really. Like I said, he's a moron. He forgot that research facilities like ours record all incoming and outgoing communications to ensure there are no leaks, he said, and reached over to the comm relay and began to copy the data file. Wait, won't that get you in trouble? His junior asked him as he and the others understood his intentions. More than if I'm framed for a crime I didn't commit. If I'm guilty, whether I do it or not, I might as well deny him the satisfaction of thinking he got away with it. The white-haired old scientist said and quietly ground his teeth together, his bushy eyebrows and wild white that stood up around a horseshoe-pattern bald head, and nobody argued the point he made while he casually entered the digital address for several major news agencies. Fuck that guy, he said, regressing to his angrier youth for a moment, and wore a relaxed smile on his face as he went to gather up his things and leave for whatever unknown future lay ahead. Breaking news today with President McNamara admitting in a holocall to top scientists that the war is going badly for the Republic, and top officials who wish to remain anonymous report from the War Department that the President has ordered a policy of slowed notifications to the families of the deceased in order to ensure the true scope of the casualties remain unknown to the general public. One source willing to comment, former State Secretary Seward, remarked that, if you have never met a man who has the ego of an emperor, the temper of a toddler, the ambition of a tyrant, and the ability of the village idiot in a village of idiots, then go and meet our president. Now let's turn to Victor Roth on the state of the economy. Rorona Jean tapped his computer and played the little whistle noise. It was a long one, a recording of a human's disbelief expressed as a sound made through puckered lips. He couldn't make the noise himself, but it was one of the more trivial things he'd picked up that he liked about their culture. So much said in one wordless noise, he mused, and tapped the contact icon for the boost team. The Bureau of Unusual Statistics, typically pronounced bosses, was a unique feature in Intakana government and always had been. Only the humans had a rough equivalent, commonly referred to as Freakonomics experts. They served to look for correlations between seemingly random things to discover whether or not there could be a relation. In the past, they'd found relationships between diet and a particular disease present in the elderly and revolutionized diet and medicine. They found correlations between crime rates and slave auction employment, revealing that when the bondage economy went down, those who worked in it and lost their jobs were more likely to prey on their fellow citizens than other industries. And now he turned to them for an answer to unspoken suspicions. Kasara, what do you have for me? He asked. You were right, Governor, she said while still looking down at her tablet. We analyzed population statistics across multiple non-human worlds, studying the process of insurance records and cross-referencing ages, species, and Rorona blinked a few times, and Kasara briefly stiffened. Excuse me, Governor. Our conclusions are twofold. The drafts are targeting non-humans, specifically ones outside cities or on minor, insignificant worlds. Moreover, they are dying at an alarming rate. The actual reported numbers simply do not explain how there could be a 60% rise in payments among the young of so many species. Could it be explained by way of plague? Rorona asked. Or perhaps hunger due to the conflict? Or by the targeting of civilian positions? Rorona pressed the questions home, and Kasara immediately shot the notion down. No, sir. These are worlds that either are not under occupation or were not when these claims were made. No plague like that has been reported, let alone across species, and hunger should not be wreaking such havoc on so many worlds just yet. But just to be sure, we cross-checked our numbers with labor allocation requests and found that employer hiring went up significantly months before each round of claims. They had to hire people to replace drafted workers. Rorona shivered. And the humans? Their outer worlds show much smaller losses in every respect. Kasara's answer gave the governor all that he needed. I see. Route that data to me at once, Kasara. Excellent work. He replied, and she answered with her customary competence. I already did, Governor. Within minutes, Rorona sent copies of the compiled report to every regional governor and planetary magistrate, as well as the various news agencies that dominated the public sphere. I would not want to be where the president is right now. He will be lucky if he doesn't end up like my cousins, Rorona muttered, and walked with a cheery step to relax while he waited for the inevitable calls of everyone from the Idiaksa to the Kana, demanding to know if the report was real. The cloud was thick and ancient beyond words. What possibly could have happened here? Admiral Pike whispered, as she watched a piece of what must have been a planet once float on by her view screen. The burn marks on the fragment of planetary debris still had the remnants of artificial construction. Buildings that, when she zoomed in, she could see were once almost human-like skyscrapers. There were also houses, and some 60 billion corpses perfectly preserved in the vacuum of space. Their numbers included some unfamiliar animals, but also what seemed to be an unknown species of alien. One flew close, his limp body thudding against the sensor array, then drifting off to continue its lonely orbit around the ancient star. The thick cloud was an ugly shade of green and thoroughly radioactive, so much so that smaller ships in the fleet had to be completely shut down, abandoned temporarily, and the crews brought onto larger, better shielded vessels. Those ships were now double and triple roomed, and all functions but life support were turned off, and even that was off everywhere it wasn't needed. Outside the cloud, the fleet fought advanced technology with the most primitive means. Simple centuries-old radio relay systems. They would take some 10 minutes to relay information, but they were so primitive that Susan hoped they wouldn't be noticed. If there's enough natural radio waves and radiation, they shouldn't notice something that slight. She reassured herself, but the moment lingered, and the tension was heightened with every hour. The cloud pulsed as the fleet allowed itself to be carried in the orbit of the ancient star. The pulse of radioactive storms rattled the ships with a slight hum that could be felt through their feet, but nothing happened. Come on, Yi. She prayed to nothing and everything, and wiped the sweat from her dark brow. She was not alone in her anxiousness. One crew member bobbed their left leg up and down at the heel in a way that was as impossible not to notice as it was annoying. In her right ear she could hear her tactical officer grinding his teeth. There seemed no end of ways that the crew could express their worry. The drawn-out silence was as the sands of an hourglass drifting down, noiseless and interminable. The first radio signal confirming the arrival of the in the system redoubled the moment. "Ma'am, they're here," Tactical whispered. None dared speak aloud, lest by some unknown technology even a common volume could alert their hunters. "And the special units are moving, ma'am," he added, his eyes glued to the readout beneath his eyes. "What about Admiral Yi?" she pressed. "No transmissions yet, but I can't find an energy signal for him either." The response was less than ideal, but there was no time to ask more. "They're engaging," he added, and Susan closed her eyes and made a mental note to remind herself to write up the awards for every member of the suicide squads in person. If they're engaging, Yi did his part, they should see him jump to warp and... She did not finish the thought. In typical Co fashion, they disabled the gas mining facility of the Republic, and then paused to repair the damaged ships. Catching the fleet seemed to be a matter of disinterest, as if they thought, "We'll get them eventually when there's nowhere left to run to." Bastards. She cursed under her breath and waited for discovery and death or isolation and life for her amalgam of ships. Admiral Kitska's body all but oozed the ichor out of his body as his stress went up. "We should not be here," he said in a hushed voice as if whispering within one of the great temples of his homeworld. Nobody heard him. The rest of the crew were engaged in the great knowing. Instead of one link from person to person, it was a shared collective consciousness, done only during supremely spiritual experiences. They deemed it necessary when they entered the system where the Cataclysm War had begun. The sacred place held the bodies of ages, shrouded forever within the cloudy remnants of the many planets that had once circled the mighty star. Damn the humans forcing us to follow them into this holy ground. Kitska thought again before he picked up the signal he was looking for. Powerful warp signatures. Blurred by the ambient radiation of the system, his viewscreen was good enough at least to see them approach. "Damn you!" He cursed and set the AI systems to work with him to annihilate the little suicide fleet that lay ahead of the main force. They were fewer, no more than 10 compared to the 20 or 30 from prior encounters. Plasmic beams shot out along with quantum phasers and advanced phasic torpedoes. With his large numbers, they raked the ships with hellfire and damnation. But as seemed to be the norm, the Terran Republic pilots simply disengaged their AI and flew manually, using terrain in the form of planetary chunks to block the Co-fleet's shooting. And that gave the humans an advantage. To damage such a sacred relic as a fragment of a holy world was too much, even for Kitska, who bore the weight of his sin in ordering them to follow the Terran Expeditionary Force. And so of the 10 ships, 7 were destroyed safely, while the remaining 3 slammed into their targets, slaying at least a handful of gods along with themselves. Devils and lucky devils, the Admiral thought, first of the humans, then of his own who were blessed to add their bodies to the sacred system. As the ship debris scattered, he refocused his screen to see if the Terran Admiral was blasphemous to engage, but instead he saw them wink out of existence as they reached the hyperlane's critical entry point and disappeared. "Bots, repair the damage. Then we will go from this place and chase our prey until they fall." The bots did not care much for the Admiral's unrelated instructions, but they would obey. 16 hours to repair. That will be enough," he muttered as the report streamed across his eyes. "I am unworthy to be here for even as long as that, but they will forgive us. Then we can go." He swore to the divine in the quietness of his mind and waited with bated, breathless relief for the signal that repairs were complete. He did not properly regain his breath until they left the system behind, unaware of what he left at his back. Sergeant Carney sat in his bunk and tapped again on his mobile device. "This channel has been blocked for your location." Stared back at him. "What the hell?" he asked himself as he stared at his blue-skinned reflection on the screen. One of his human comrades in arms heard him and sat up on the weathered green cot that served as the de facto furnishing for their unit. "Blocked you too, did they?" "Two? Is this happening to everybody?" Sergeant Carney asked and drew his lips tight as he looked over to see Specialist Mendoza's cybernetic eyes staring back at him. The soldier's eyes had been melted from their sockets at the last world, and a set of cyber eyes replaced them at the very next drop point. Their red hue was distinctive, almost eerie, especially in the darkness after lights out. "Yes, but there's a way around it. The trouble is, you're using the common net." Mendoza smirked and held up his hand. "Let me help you out." Mark tossed his mobile device over to the next bed and watched as the cybernetic eyes connected to the device, flickering briefly as they linked up, and seconds later, "Done," Mendoza remarked and tossed the device back. "I hooked it to a localized VPN and routed it through the spike transmission interface used by the CO at their landing point. They monitor all Terran public communications and autosync with the local net, so it's pretty easy to work around. At least it is so long as you have unpatched software and a cybernetic eye link," he added, and then drew one finger down the center of his right eye to symbolize a wink, and admit he wasn't supposed to do any of those things. Carney stared down at the device. "On the one hand, he's violating regs, lots of regs. On the other, I don't like this. Being kept in the dark about the rest of the Republic. They weren't doing this before. Why now?" Worry for his adoptive family back home struck deep in his soul. worry for worlds he'd never been to, worry for the Republic he sought to defend. The rules said he should turn Mendoza in, but looking down at his cybernetic hand that glinted in the light of the screen, it felt wrong in every sense. Mendoza didn't even seem to care, and out of one ear he heard somebody else curse over a blocked access. And again the young man's voice went up, offering to get him hooked up. Carney swallowed the lump in his throat and tapped the screen again. The embattled President McNamara had this to say about the disproportionate drafting of aliens and the disproportionate awarding of medals and promotions to human soldiers. This was a temporary measure. It was a way to both evacuate threatened worlds and to give them a chance to protect their own homes. Our next step will be to spare more of our people danger by way of a new technology. I will call upon the Senate to begin the full-scale use of cloned soldiers, thus sparing the lives of citizens republic-wide. Sergeant Carney replayed the recording twice before he went back to look at other news he missed. "No, this can't be," he said as he began scrolling through reports and news outlets, then onto message boards and public town square sites, where all citizens could relay their beliefs and concerns to one another. And the more he read, the more he spent time counting the new recruits who came into his unit to replace the dead. The humans were now few, mostly just those who had somehow survived battle after battle. It had been 6 planets since another human had been seen as either a recruit or a draftee. The xenomorph handlers were all human, the officers were almost all human. But the common boot, it's so obvious now. He was supposed to fall asleep, to get some rest before they went out to the forward group's prepared battle positions, but he could not. And from the sound of the curses at other bunks, he was not alone. Admiral Pike slipped out of the cloud at sunlight speed. Her fleet was growing, and with the purchase of a number of Bavragan mercenary ships, she was now better off than before. Moreover, the nearest gas and energy harvesting systems had been converted into minor construction facilities, and with the support of Inta Kana and Kana volunteers that made the perilous journey to their rendezvous point, her forces were rapidly closing in on their former strength. The last of the repairs were finally made, and her crews, both old and new alike, were rapidly improving as they engaged in combat drills using the simulation systems that came with the newest model ship designs. As she neared the warp point, she glanced again at the sensor array. "Please don't be behind us." She asked the universe for a favor, and was blessed with the sight of nothing at her back before her fleet jumped into the hyperlane. She cast a thought toward Admiral Yi, still being pursued by the bulk of the Co-Armada going ever deeper into Republic space, losing solar arrays, gas harvesting stations, and mining facilities. "But no battles," she muttered under her breath. He would run out of places to go eventually, but for now it kept the destruction to a minimum. The stars raced past her, and for the moment at least, she felt a faint sense of shameful relief that there was distance between herself and the might of the Co-Armada. No battles could be waged in the hyperlanes of the galaxy, and it took days to pass from system to system, and so for that brief span of time it served as the weekend for her and the rest of the crew. She slept and ate, and did her best to relax between plans for the next drills, her route taking her through conquered territory that she did not dare to take back. As she reached the end of the hyperlane, the Armada set its engines to sunlight speed and ran with minimal power output for the full month it took to cross the path of the burning white star. And Susan stared in silence at the equally quiet stations that were its only company. A silent mine captured by the Co and shut down, and a solar collector shut down in the same way. They gave nothing to anyone now, except for giving her and the crew the creeps. When we die out, if we die out, is this our fate? To leave just silent machines trapped in place waiting to be discovered by some future empire of a sort we can't even imagine? Are we in our decline already, as the Keepers warned when they asked for some of our people to inhabit a zoo? It was an unpleasant thought. The Keepers were another of the ancient empires that were now but a stagnant fragment of themselves, and had warned that humanity might not last another 300 years. The Co seemed bent on driving that down to decades. But what then? The question haunted her, gnawed at her guts, and she took to sitting in her chair and just watching the nothingness of an empty void. If we fail, we're damned, but if we succeed, we might be damned anyway. The Admiral pondered as she reviewed the newscast in her mind. The late John Brown had been a man of such principle that he was seen as exceptional even by his enemies. His commitment to the Republic transcended species and welcomed even those aliens he'd seen defeated. President McNamara, however. If they expect the Republic to just use them, then why should any alien be loyal to the Republic and clones? Can he really not see a problem with just breeding living, thinking people to fight? She looked down at the dark skin of her hand and tried to imagine how a clone of herself might feel, dragged from a vat, thrown into a uniform and a ship and being sent out to fight and die while her original self relaxed at ease somewhere far from danger. "We may as well clutch a serpent to our own breast and dare it to bite," she muttered. "Ma'am?" her first officer asked as he caught the sound of her voice, if not her words. She waved a sweaty hand with a dismissive air. "It's nothing, I was just thinking out loud. Stay the course, we've got a long road to get back to the space of the Ascended Co if we want to put a boot up their asses." "Yes, ma'am," he answered, a gleam of anticipation in his eye as the fleet sailed on. Rorona Jean listened patiently to Admiral Yi, his fingers crossed in his lap and his hologram showing his body only from the chest up. The human admiral used a similar posture, neither giving away more in their body language than they absolutely had to. "This will cost many lives," the governor of the once mighty empire said with a grave tone. "Not as much as you think. The worlds are sparsely populated, and even if the Co place no value on any lives but their own, they don't go out of their way to take them. Besides, they hold humans more responsible for the debacle than anyone." "As they should," Rorona interjected. "As they should." The admiral agreed, and Rorona felt himself relax at the rebukeful tone of the military genius. "More than that, the only way to win this war is to not lose it. And you know what happens if we fail," the admiral pointed out. Rorona's hands tensed. The Intakana were not a much-loved species, not even by former coalition members. If humanity falls, the Bavragan might expand or start raiding our territory. They might just enjoy enslaving us when we're broken, selling us to the Kana, who are still more than a little vengeful. Even if that doesn't happen, general warfare is sure to break out over the scraps of the Republic. The number of ways in which it could all go wrong were far more numerous, and his sense of caution, that which had preserved his people even in the face of possible annihilation, drove him to answer. "I don't want the Republic to lose either, but if I'm to fulfill what you ask, I need some guarantees from you, Admiral." Rorona replied and leaned forward as he spoke. "You should talk to the President. I'm an admiral, not a politician." Admiral Yi replied with the faint trace of a frown appearing on his face. "The President can't give me what I want, and even if he could, would you trust him if you were in my position?" the governor asked, and Admiral Yi's stone-faced silence answered plenty. "What do you want?" the admiral asked, drawing out his words as if to emphasize the gravity of the moment where history as it would be made hung in the balance. "Your support after all this is over. The President will blame me somehow, and if he doesn't, his party will. I don't want to see my people suffer further under foolish leadership. We had quite enough of that when my cousin was in charge. Admiral Yi's endorsement of my actions should make me politically unassailable, assuming you win," Rorona pointed out, and to that Yi answered. "And if I do not? Then we are all dead men anyway, and my request means nothing," Rorona pointed out. The sword of Damocles seemed to dangle between them both as the two leaders faced each other across the void of space, quiet stares, searching alien faces and alien eyes for some hint of deception or defect of will that could bring the other down. "As a show of good faith, I will reroute the fleet to buy you time to evacuate as many people from those worlds as possible. We will come from Stellar North. Direct your reinforcements to meet us at Harmegiddo, and then we will conquer or die." Yi promised and rose to his feet. "I will be on that world myself. Our fates are joined, Admiral, so in the human fashion I wish us both luck," Rorona said and rose to his feet in turn. "And I hope we do not need it," the Admiral answered, and then the connection ended. John shouted with fury at nothing. He was alone in the empty office, but he shouted about everything. His polling numbers scrolled across the screen. "A 12% approval rating? Investigations! I am the Empire! They don't have the right!" He slammed his fist on the surface of his desk, cursed, and yanked his hand up to rub it in the palm of its opposite. The pain brought him back to his senses. Rage and fury, however, did not abate. He wanted to ask how it had gotten out, how his quiet orders, spoken in person only to select officials, had been uncovered. The answer was obvious in the broad strokes, at least. One of the alien governors, it had to be. But how? And which one? None of them had been willing to speak, and worse, Now the human ones were hostile too. He glanced at the latest Senate races. There were a lot of aliens on the ballots, more than there had been in years. The president glanced at one of the few opinion pieces written in favor of him. They're just voting for aliens to show they're not xenophobic, and that makes for bad policy. Even in supporting me, they make me sound bad. He grumbled and glared at the monitors as if daring the array of regional governors to appear and challenge him. At least the worst is over. All we have to do is hold on. If I can just keep the anti-war demonstrations down, which I can do, as long as the Co are seen as worse. That utterance left a chill down his spine that settled in the same place in his gut where all his spite at the betrayals around him. But beyond his wrath, he could think of nothing else to do, except to sit and stew. Sergeant Carney dove for cover and took down his comrade with him. Specialist Mendoza grunted as he landed uncomfortably on his belly. But before he could even address what Carney had just done, the blue-skinned alien was back up in a kneeling position, firing at the oncoming Co-infantry. "What I wouldn't give for more xenomorphs," somebody said from behind them. But it was an empty phrase, one repeated often. Carney recalled the budgetary expenditures, so much was going into new ships. The new round of draftees were less capable, less well-trained, less well-armed, and less willing to fight than ever. He found it hard to blame them. How can I? I feel the same way. Human shouldn't just mean from Earth ancestry. I'm a citizen too. We all are. We deserve better than to be thrown into a damn meat grinder. He cursed his own frustrated thoughts as beams of death spat out of his rifle, marking his target for his support squad to fire on too. The Co-shielding was good but not unstoppable. A concentrated fire would force them to stop or die, or better yet, both. A Co-soldier stumbled and fell, not by fire but by way of another primitive trap their systems were too advanced to detect. The screams were alien but also familiar. Leg caught in a bear trap, that'll leave a mark. Or it would, the sergeant thought, and put a beam through the exposed top of the Co-helmet where he was most vulnerable. The screaming stopped, but the Co who lived continued to come on. A series of bursts went up that for that moment, at least bought time, and a flash of inspiration struck the alien NCO. "Mendoza! Do those eyes record too or just see?" "Used to be just see, but I made some mods. Why?" the human asked as he struggled to rise. "Start filming. Let's see how the people back home like seeing what we're doing for their sakes," the NCO bellowed, and Mendoza did not need to be told twice. And as he filmed the young alien and the firefight around them, Carney declared with frustration, "I'm a citizen too, damn it. I was born in the Republic. How can they just use us like this, just because I'm not a Homo sapien? Don't they realize humanity is more than skin deep?" Neither realized how viral that moment of anguished frustration and pain expressed in one simple sentence would electrify the Republic media. The Co-fleet emerged from the hyperlane and emerged for the first time in millennia, into intercana space. Their engines pulsed like beating hearts as the Citadel and its myriad of weapon platforms. The missile loadouts, beam defenses, and all the most advanced technology the Terran Republic could provide for the defense of the planet at its back. And it all seemed as nothing in the eyes of the ascended Co. Fools. As if they can do more than buy themselves a little time to die some other day. There would be a few casualties, a few weeks' delay, but the end would be the same. Exterminate the blasphemers. The order went out in digital form, and in common knowing the Co opened fire, and so too did the Intercana forces. Missiles and rockets flared in the night sea, the beams of light raced ahead of those, and the battle was joined. The Intercana fielded few ships of war to the support of the minor world, and they were a mere token force, a handful of cruisers and a fewer number of frigates. The Co, true to their doctrine, prioritized vessels only to find, why aren't we hitting? Why are they this fast? There wasn't a captain in their ranks who failed to notice the way the small ships bobbed and weaved and shot down Co projectiles, even as the contemptible mass fire of the Republic Citadel and its supporting platforms began to impact their targets. Concentrated fire began to hit Co ships, and bursts of death by fire appeared to dot the Co formation. Little by little, the smaller ships of the Republic fleet were destroyed, and the fire began to redirect toward the support platforms and the Citadel. Last time we fought such a platform, it took 15 minutes to destroy. This time, it took 20. They learn, but have yet to learn their place. The Admiral of the Co pondered as he watched the Citadel erupt in silent flames across the black field of battle. 18 Ko ships had been destroyed, and a dozen more damaged. What's 1 month to repair? The Admiral pondered as he watched Admiral Yi complete his retreat without engaging. There's only so many places to run, and we only have to catch you once. And then what hope do you have? He sought an answer and found, pleasantly enough, none. Admiral Yi watched as the star in front of him went from a blur to a bright blue ball. The Ko were still behind him, but he had time yet. They took more casualties than I thought. The hollow ships worked their magic. He couldn't help but be pleased. With no crew to speak of, just a handful of AI bots, the ships had no life support systems, no recreational quarters, no scientific tools. They had nothing but energy and point defense weapons, and since they were not built to survive, there was no reason not to redline their engines. It had kept the Ko firing for much longer than was reasonable, and extended the life of the weapons platforms significantly. With more decoy ships being built on the daily, the day of reckoning was fast approaching. Take us to the other end of the system and make ready to jump warp. Once the Ko attack this system, we leap again just like before. Once we do, we set the trap and make ready to spring it. Sir, we're getting another command relayed through the Intercana network. The President is threatening to fire and replace you if you don't win a battle soon. The comms officer spoke up, and Yi snorted with disgust. For months since his retreat, he'd dodged the communications of that moron, but now seemed the perfect opportunity. Relay a message to him, Yi ordered. Sir, what should it say? The comms officer asked. Admiral Yi did not take long to send his answer. Fire me if you want, but I would rather do something right than follow your orders. President McNamara glared at the screen as the relay audio replayed. The Admiral had the goal to post his firing through the public net. He'd heard it played on every network, and now the whole Republic knew. The military has no confidence in me. Treacherous bastards. So he did the only thing he could think of. As he watched the report of Admiral Yi's retreat from the second stage of the Intercana space, without firing a shot of his own, he readied a public statement. Admiral Yi has displayed cowardice before the enemy, a reluctance to fight, expressed defeatist statements before we ever began, and has been a discouraging element in the military from the beginning. What's more, such reluctance causes me to question his loyalty to our cause, and as such I am ordering his removal officially as of today, and am dispatching a replacement who will seize control of the fleet and seize victory from the Ko at last. With his removal, we can at last route the Armada to the danger zones and root out the occupiers. He tried not to notice the doubtful looks he was receiving as he read off his statement over the widest-reaching Republic network, but it was clear before he was halfway done that his audience was doubtful. Traitors at every end. He cursed in his own mind and kept his face impassive despite his desire to explode on them all. By the time the questions began to come on, the President was just done. No, I will not answer questions about the fake videos made by malcontents and disloyal elements within the Republic military. You can't seriously believe that anybody would be filming in the middle of a war. It's obviously just made up to make me look bad. He snapped as his temper slipped, and he stomped away as the monitors shut off, ending his conference on a sour, furious note. Susan Pike sat at her desk reviewing the latest training results. The foe casualties were obscene, but victory continued to present itself. The casualties were trending down as the drills went on, but no matter what, she knew there was a rock bottom after which they could not cut losses further. The problem, of course, was finding it. She glanced at the ship reports. 3 more battleships were added from a nearby system, their crews made up of another former coalition species that had been only little less oppressed than the Kana years before. Lured by the promise of restoring their pride as a people conquered by one species and liberated by another, their need to prove themselves brought them to take their place at the tip of the Republic's spear as they drew ever closer to the pre-war border and toward their best single hope of victory, of a sort, however circuitous it might have been. The once poor spirits of the defeated Armada were picking up, and with their nerve to fight once more restored, all she could do was wait for the time to come and strike a blow that she hoped would bring the war to a close, if not by victory, then at least by avoiding defeat. Admiral Yi settled into position and waited. His estimation of Rorona Jean's resolve went up another notch as he watched the video transmission from down below. Here is my way to leave this world, the alien said and pointed to his ship, and then calmly took a blaster cannon in both hands, leveled it at the engine, and fired at the engine. It erupted in toxic green smoke, and he stepped back from the shuttle. I am governor of this region, and I'm not running. Whether I and this world live or die depends on you. Show the Co we are not afraid and bring glory and victory to our republic. They'll fight like demons for him now if it comes to it, Admiral Yi said with a rare smile. The majority of the reinforcing ships was made up of aliens, and the majority of those were of Inta-Kana and Kana sailors. The tension of working with former masters was somewhat mitigated by a combination of their dire straits and Rorona's reputation as a reformer who welcomed their liberation and took strides even at personal risk and expense to compensate the former captives with land, prosecution of the worst offenders, and back pay that created a new social class of wealthy Kana elites who became some of his most ardent supporters. Privately, Yi had his doubts about his sincerity and the totality of the blame that his late cousins had ended up with. But there was no doubting his efficacy. He'd adapted so masterfully to the changing political climate that he now had allies and admirers across a multitude of cultures, and this display of courage? It can only magnify his reputation. But that was for the future, and it was time for Yi to address the fleet. He flipped the comm channel on and said, "The Co are as arrogant as they are stagnant. You are as brave as you are many. Show them the difference that makes, and let's end this game." The drums went up across ships and began to stir the blood as the Co armada came on. They had lost something of their numbers, a few in each engagement, but they had also gained some experience, and they were reluctant when it came to the star, pausing for hours just out of reach to scan the system and ensure they were not tricked a second time. Yi's little smile formed as he watched and saw into the mind of his enemy. He has learned to be wary, but not wary enough. His smile became predatory as the two armadas began to close the gap, and the hollow ships and special vessels ranged out in front and on the wings, acting as sponges to absorb fire and distract the Co forces. In name, his armada outnumbered the Co by 5-1. In practice, it was only 3-1, since the specialized ships could act only as point defense and distractions. But the toll of the difference began to show. Explosions blocked out the sun of Har-Megiddo again and again, as warp cores and other drive types were breached and killed the ships wrapped around them, and Yi felt his ship rock and rumble as Co fire targeted his dreadnought. Bits of metal and burned-up corpses floated freely in space, only to be further ripped apart or vaporized or simply smashed against an oncoming ship, like they were mere bugs against car windshields. The citadel and its supporting platforms continued to act as heavy artillery, targeting large ships and allowing smaller, weaker vessels to swoop in, and the line of Terran ships continued to expand, with those behind sweeping out to the right and forcing the Co to extend ever farther out and away from the star. Where a ship died, a ship from the rear rushed in to replace it, and the battle of numbers began to tell the difference, at least when there was no one running. Why are they extending the line? They should be concentrating their fire. Don't they know they're weakening their position? The Co-Admiral was not the only one to wonder this until, to his delight, he saw the Terran Republic ships begin to draw themselves back. Ah, to ensure they do not get in each other's way as they flee. Yes, yes. He nodded as he spoke. Advance, straight through their center. As the Republic ships began to withdraw, they rallied behind the citadel. 60 Republic ships were wrecks or worse, and the system was now flooded with the blood of its defenders. Hold that line, Yi ordered. Fire when ready. Keep the station at the center. The Co came onward. With the citadel in front, they had no choice but to either target it first or be fired upon without retaliation, an unthinkable thing in their hearts. And so they raced in to keep their violation of combat doctrine to a minimum. Finish them! The Co-Admiral and his many captains roared. Finish them! Admiral Pike yelled as her ships warped in behind the Co-Armada, and Yi began to laugh in his chair as one long, loud noise came over the entire Republic fleet. An entire Terran armada shouting, "Woo-hoo!" All at the same moment, the noise rivaled in its power only by the light show of another 90 ships firing everything they had all at once into the rear of the Co forces. Smile, you son of a bitch! He hissed as his concentrated fire proved that a Terran dreadnought was capable of destroying a Co cruiser with concentrated fire. And a cascade of destruction began as Co ships were smashed and shields flared in a rainbow of colors before they failed completely, and their hulls were hammered like nails and bent like stalks of grain before the typhoon. Their line of battle collapsed and Republic ships ceased to die. replaced instead by the domino effect of co-ship after co-ship being turned into scrap metal. The co-admiral never offered to surrender, nor communicated in any way. It was, in Admiral Yi's own mind, a fitting end for a stubborn people. There's not much difference between damn brave and damn foolish sometimes. All you can do is hope you're being the first without being the second. And sometimes you fail, he thought as the light show died. And the planet below began to cheer in tandem with the victorious Republic fleet. It took time for word to spread to the war-weary Republic. The want of a victory had left the once proud people with a mix of exhaustion and shame. A shame that was redoubled as reports of their elected president's conduct and policies toward his direct employees and toward the alien citizens. But the word did spread, and the video reports with it. The president, however, found less to celebrate than the rest of the Republic as he listened to the Admiralty. With this armada destroyed, we begin reclaiming the lost territory, and we will make straight for the co-interior, to finally end this scourge once and for all. And in this time of victory, we must give special thanks not only to those who sacrificed all in the defense of the Republic, but to regional governors whose special efforts went above and beyond the call of civilian duty, like Governor Roronajan, who as firmly as any soldier stood with courage against the scourge, putting his life on the line for all of us. Admiral Yi's speech was bad, but was it worse than Admiral Pike's? Without the alien contributions to the fleet, there would be no fleet. We would have no victory. Their wisdom and bravery stand as a testament to the principles of the Republic, and demonstrate beyond any doubt that a brave many can salvage victory from the defeat we would have suffered thanks to the misguided efforts of a foolish few. He wasn't sure. He sat, hunched over in his office, sweat dripping down his brow. I just can't believe it. I can't, he thought as he drew his hand down his face to drag away the sweat. She hadn't actually said his name. Being apolitical was how the military was meant to be. She had plausible deniability for all the good that did the president in the wake of this new PR nightmare. His firing and the investigation, the questions of his loyalty, those are all shot to shit now. It's like he planned it, like he planned not to win until I'd made an ass out of myself. Now not only are they heroes of the Republic, but Admiral Yi has as good as endorsed Governor Jean. If I'm followed by an alien of all things, history will judge that I was so bad a president that the Republic didn't want a human in charge of it again. This can't possibly get worse. He clenched his hair and tugged, the pain in his body distracting him from the pain in his mind. And as he sought an answer of some sort, any sort, a transmission came through. The shadowy forms of the ascended Co were visible on screen, and their rough voices cut straight to the heart of their reason for calling upon the Republic. You have suffered loss, blasphemers of the Republic, and in our benevolence we are willing to forgive. The arrogance and pride you have displayed, however, must have an accounting. Remove the one you have chosen as your voice and the embodiment of your law, and we will return your captured worlds to you without further deaths. Think not too highly of your recent victory, for all you did was drown in your blood, a mere fraction of our might. President McNamara sat stunned, disbelieving as he watched the demand replay. It took a moment to properly comprehend the magnitude of their words, but when he did, he shot to his feet, shaking his fists in disbelief as he shouted, "No, no, no, no! I'm the president! I am the president!" Before he even finished the last word, the auto data collection system began spitting data back at him. This unique system allowed an AI-guided Quanda system to create questions based off of data and provide the data itself as an answer to the question, essentially reversing the system of creating the question and then searching for data. Instead, it gathered data and generated the results, then created the question itself so that the user would know what they were looking at. And it did so based entirely off of the social networks of Republic citizens. It had its drawbacks. It could not gather unspoken data, the opinions of those who withdrew from technological integration into their lives, or those who simply found social media use to be a toxic waste of their precious time. But it mapped out general societal trends with disturbing accuracy. Should the president resign his office? A 97% return of yes among aliens, an 88% return of yes among humans. Should there be a recall election? The results were near identical. Should there be a new leader elected at once? The results were near identical. The exhaustion of the Republic sat heavy on them all. It can't possibly be worse, he muttered under his breath. And if this is as bad as it gets, I can still salvage this. No sooner had his mind begun to turn on the issue than a reporter's face appeared on screen. We've just received a breaking report. A leaked classified document regarding the starship Tonkin, which was alleged to have been destroyed by the Co in an act of provocation, did not happen. There was no starship Tonkin, no attack. It was, according to our sources, an entirely false story planted on the direct order of the president to help create justification for this war. "Oh, fuck!" the president shouted, and holocalls began to bombard his office in an instant. Senators from every world, governors from every sector, members of the press, not to mention neighbor nations and allies. The next few hours became a flurry of activity as the embattled president shouted denials to stern faces and furious ones alike. "It's not true!" he shouted and raged, his once fine suit now drenched in sweat, his professionally done hair turned into a mix of sweat slickness and wild disarray. His regal demeanor and intimidating air reduced him to the appearance of a man recently rendered homeless, who was wearing his last and only suit, and gone from functioning member of society to shouting his conspiracy theories to people who hurried away to avoid seeing him. "It's a conspiracy, an alien lie, a misdirection. It's all fake news. The media have been against me from the beginning. I am the president. I should be believed. I didn't do anything wrong. I was acting under my authority as given to me by our Constitution." In his haste and rageful shouts and denials, he overlooked that his last denial sounded much like a confession, and the stories blew up even larger. In the days that followed the revelation and the Co-ultimatum and peace offer, Roronajan watched the administration of the most powerful empire in this part of space fall apart like a house of cards. Administrators fled his side like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Not a one refrained from disavowing him, expressing regret for ever working with him, and more than a few went down the path of petty insults. He was impossible to work for because he didn't understand the limits of what we could do, demanding things we couldn't do, then blaming us as if we decided how things worked. He is a nasty piece of work, never taking responsibility for anything. More a high school bully, no, a middle school bully than a president. All he cares about is what people think of him, which is sad, because nobody should think well of him at all. Rorona almost pitied the man, but not enough to take advantage of the moment. "Lend me your support, and we can elect the first ever alien president of the Republic," Rorona said to the regional governors who responded to his call. "Endorse me, and our Republic will be renewed. The humans might have their doubts still, but I have the perfect running mate." Rorona waved a hand toward his right side, and Admiral Yi stepped into view and addressed the assembly. "The President's last act before victory was to terminate my service to the Republic's military. As such, I no longer have a job. I suppose Vice President of the Republic will serve as an adequate stepping stone. I know there are issues yet when it comes to the Intakana, but I fought the man to my left, and if I am willing to trust him, I hope you will trust me when I say what you admired in humanity is also in him. Our new party will need a name," the Idiaxa governor pointed out. Her long tongue fairly trembled with anticipation, as did her wide gossamer wings. "I believe we already have it," Rorona suggested, and a myriad of different silent glances met the former emperor. "The Humanity Party," Rorona clarified. Savvy politicians, to one degree or another for each of them, it wasn't hard to recognize the value of the name. It wouldn't alienate the majority Terran population, and since the recent viral footage of Sergeant Carney and other aliens who had been raised by humans saying things like, "Humanity is more than skin deep," the principal meaning of the term was ripe to undergo a shift. "My first act as president will be to award medals to the aliens who were overlooked unfairly. My second will to change the draft laws to ensure our species will never be a factor again. I swear if John Brown were still alive, he would have hacked John McNamara to death with his own hands over that ploy." Various nods and rumbles of agreement were returned to Governor Jean. It had been a long-standing story that John Brown had, in his younger years on the frontier, hacked slavers to death with a machete after they crash-landed near his home on the frontier, and that he hung a bloody machete on his wall as a point of pride in his actions. But as to the truth of it, nobody knew. But the sentiment endeared him to one and all, as Rorona's casual praise for his one-time enemy lent him yet more credibility. "We have a party. Now let us get you elected," the governor of the territory most occupied by the sacred dark declared. Mark cast his vote with a smile in his soul. The Co were not far beyond the horizon, but in anticipation of the obvious result, they demonstrated a rare moment of benevolence and held back on their advance to allow the recall election to take place, and in tandem with that, a new election to follow. For him, as with his entire unit, the choice was obvious. Yes, to recall McNamara, and then another to vote in favor of Governor Jean. He said his vote out loud, more than content to let everyone around him know where he stood. It was easy, as he was not just the peace candidate, but he had a reputation for courage and sagacity, and a strangely favorable amount of support in some unexpected places. How he convinced the Khana to support him I will never guess. The NCO thought, but it was a relief that he'd managed it. He glanced toward the video monitor where the news played on. And in today's top story, the Senate has voted to impeach President McNamara for his deception in the Starship Tonkin incident, with the majority and minority speakers issuing a joint statement saying, "The manufacture of false conflict is a breach of the moral obligations of his office, and that cannot be allowed." We still have no word on whether or not he will be criminally charged for his actions, but Sergeant Carney flipped his mobile device to his public video service. The viral clip of his declaration had definitely had its impact. "I wonder if they took their slogan from me. Nah, gotta be a coincidence," he thought as he left the polling place and slung his rifle while he exited the building. There was still a guard shift to pull, just in case the Co tried a surprise attack, but the chances of that were low. Nobody on either side even wanted to fight anymore, he was sure of it. His many battles had not just left him with scars, but with an almost prescient sense of when there was blood in the air and a battle was nigh. And the world, no, the universe seemed as calm as a graveyard now. Specialist Mendoza slapped him on the back as he walked up to take his turn on shift. "Voted?" the young soldier asked, and his squad leader gave a sharp nod. "For the Humanity Party. Straight ticket, there's just no reason for me to vote for anyone else," Sergeant Carney said without hesitation. "I'll go do the same, Mabe. Once we count the votes, we can just go home, eh?" he asked with a hopeful air. Sergeant Carney couldn't laugh in the way his human counterpart could, but he snorted at least. "I think it'll take a few weeks more, but not much. He's just finished, just like this war." "So, is this a victory for us, or did we lose? I mean, we only won a single battle, really," Specialist Mendoza asked and removed his helmet to scratch the dark hair and burned scalp alike. He should have reprimanded the young soldier for removing his helmet on guard duty, but for once Sergeant Carney let it pass. "I'm just a non-com. I can't really say. It sure didn't feel like winning, running from planet to planet. But then, with Admiral Yi destroying over 70% of the Co fleet, maybe we were about to turn it around. It happened last time, too. I guess if we didn't win, we at least didn't lose. That's good enough for me. As long as I get to go home, I don't have enough left in me to care anyway. But I am glad we didn't end up using clones. Not doing that is kind of a win, too. That could have got mighty ugly," Sergeant Carney declared with an exaggerated shiver as he pictured hundreds or thousands of copies of himself being thrown into the meat grinder of war. "It'd feel like sending my brothers out to die just so I don't have to take risks. Thank God we didn't go that road." He then put it out of his mind as Specialist Mendoza said something that Carney missed and headed off to vote for the party that would bring him home again. "It's not true, you can't do this to me," the disheveled President McNamara shouted as he clung to his desk. The service officers hadn't actually grabbed him and dragged him away from his seat, but as 1 minute of denial bled into the next, they were drawing closer to doing exactly that. The heavy-set guard with the bulging muscles leaned forward imploringly, his meaty hands outstretched as if to offer salvation to the desperate. His voice, frustrated and tense, was a sharp contrast to his almost gentle posture. "Sir, the recall election is over. You are not the president, and even if it weren't, the Senate also returned an impeachment vote with only one opposed. It is over. Keep the what little dignity you've got left." "The election was invalid. We were threatened by the Co. People still support me. They elected me. It's just that—" Whatever he was about to say next as he sprayed spittle with his refusals, it was cut off by the noise of the video monitor. And in a landslide victory, Governor Rorona Jean been elected as the first alien president of the Republic of Man. His opponents have reached out to congratulate him on his victory, and we can see him now boarding the Red Dawn to take his long journey to Earth and begin naming his choices for the various cabinet offices, while the Co have begun their withdrawals from Republic territory in earnest, with an expected complete withdrawal date of 2418.11.11.11 of the standard galactic cycle. The aliens are against us. It's sedition. It's treason. The news kept spreading lies about me, President John McNamara declared, his previous rant's continuation forgotten. A whole new one began in its place, but it was the news the security team had waited for. With their duty being to the president-elect, not to the discharged, disgraced, official ex-president, the two grabbed John McNamara by his shoulders, dragged him bodily over his desk, folded his arms behind his back, and began to march him bodily out the door. His howls of protest never wavered, not until they broke down into sobs when he was forced into the short-range transport that would take him into whatever passed for retirement, before his now seemingly inevitable criminal trial. His choked, childish, gulping sobs were punctuated by pointless, flailing arms, as if he were reduced from adult man to petulant toddler. The only clear words he uttered in his isolated rage continued to be his protests of status and treachery. But nobody was listening. Admiral Pike sat across from her counterpart and raised a glass. "Congratulations on the vice presidency," she said, but the former Admiral Yi only shook his head. "You know what we drink to first," he said with a solemn voice as he raised his clear glass and caused the still bourbon to stir with the motion. "To Admiral Nelson and everyone who will never drink again." Susan Pike bowed her head at the sentiment, and after they clinked their glasses together, they drank. "I thought you didn't drink alcohol," she said as the silence stretched out. "I'm a politician now. They expect a few vices. Besides, I watered mine down first," he answered, making a little wan smile when she scrunched up her face in disgust at the very idea of watering down perfectly good booze. "Do you think we'll ever go through that again?" she asked as she watched the video monitor's footage of the Co withdrawing from another world as the president-elect's ship passed by. Vice President Yi would be joining him soon, but for now it was perhaps the last time he and Admiral Pike would share a common table as peers, friends, or perhaps even at all. "If I can prevent it, no. But it's a dangerous galaxy out there, and President Jean will have his work cut out for him undoing John's mess." The vice president acknowledged. "We avoided losing, but we didn't win, and we were arguably humiliated both at home and abroad. Who knows what might challenge us next?" It was a sobering and ugly thought, enough to prompt Admiral Pike to pour another drink for herself, and another for the new vice president, though unlike her, he did not pick up his glass. "I'm putting in my retirement when we get back home," she said. "Nelson's death was a wake-up call, I guess. I've been doing this for a long time now, so long I didn't even notice how gray my hair was getting." She reached up and touched the strands that were now, as she said, were mostly silver. "If we have another fight, it'll need to be somebody with more energy than I have left to fight it. I want to die at home in comfort, not out here." The vice president took a long, slow breath. "You've earned it. But you know what they say about old soldiers. They never die. They simply fade away." In the aftermath of the horrendous struggle, the Terran Republic underwent a rapid transformation. The militia system was revised from 3 border ships to 6, with 1 hyperlane distance maintaining 3 and 2 hyperlanes maintaining 1, while the core systems and shipyards maintained larger armadas of 20 vessels or more, but keeping them permanently docked, save for exercises, in order to reduce costs. The rest of the fleet was scraped, with classified parts stripped out. The remaining ships were sold through a special mercantile program allowing former soldiers aspiring to become traders, thus renewing commerce and, thanks to generous contracts, allowing for the worlds that suffered the most damage to be resupplied quickly with aid from those worlds which had not been damaged. President Rorona Jean's oath was taken standing in the same spot as the first president, to rule over an alien-influenced election after the conquest of the people once known simply as fiends. And he began to review the records of aliens nominated for medals of valor who were denied on the basis of their species. Sergeant Carney being the first among them as the most famous thanks to his viral clip, and the footage of him saving subsequent actions included formal apologies for the policies of the former president, and included generous subsidies and payments for those negatively impacted by the biased nature of the draft, including triple payments in life insurance policies to the families of the dead, adding new aliens to the wealthy classes of the worlds in which they lived. Vast research budgets were allocated to studying the wreckage of the Co vessels which floated aimlessly around the star of Harmagiddo, and a generous budget for education began to send more and more brilliant minds to study the advanced alien technology. The ethos of the Republic lost much of its militarism and became centered more on economics and technological research to solve the problems that plagued the pre-war empire. And the very name of the Republic of Man was altered, as what it meant to be human began to change. Humanity began to shift from meaning simply Homo sapien to meaning citizen or person, and the Republic rebranded itself the Republic of Humanity. The bill to rebrand their empire, however, included one special provision. Let it be resolved that never again shall the Republic of Humanity be ruled over again by anyone named John. It was this news of his legacy that was the last John McNamara would hear as he was thrown screaming into prison after being convicted of treason against the interests of the Republic. He would descend into madness and die there 3 years later. Opinion would remain divided over whether it was just better for him to be gone, or if it would have been better for him to reach an old age before he vanished into an unlamented history. Susan Pike, true to her word, put in her retirement the very hour her ship docked in Alpha Centauri, and within 6 months she was settled on a country estate in Colorado, looking out from her mountain home over the clear waters of a lake, enjoying the calm until, true to Vice President Yee's statement of the fate of old soldiers, she faded away. The economy and stability of the Republic of Humanity would begin to restore itself as the culture became ever more inclusive of its many citizens, and they brought their own perspectives to strengthen a military that had for too long felt itself poorly led and worse used. With the popular leadership and widespread respect held by President John and Admiral Yee, the once shaky Republic would find itself having a free hand again, at least for a while, until fresh challenges arose to threaten the ascending empire. As for the nature of those challenges, that is a story for next time.